London, 1851. The chandelier above the Hargrove ballroom held 400 candles, and every single flame trembled when Duke Cadric Blackthorne walked through the door. He was not invited. The orchestra faltered. Violins scraped into silence like animals sensing a predator crossing their territory. 300 of England's most powerful men and women stood frozen mid-conversation, champagne flutes suspended, smiles dissolving, because the man who controlled half the northern shipping lanes and owned enough parliamentary debt to collapse 6 noble houses had just materialized inside a room that had spent the entire evening celebrating his rumored downfall. Cadric did not pause at the threshold. He did not scan the crowd for familiar faces. He walked forward with the mechanical certainty of a man who understood that hesitation was a language spoken only by the weak, and the weak did not survive rooms like this. His boots struck marble. Each step carried the weight of something beyond physical presence. It was authority distilled into motion, the kind earned not through inheritance alone, but through years of making powerful men regret the moment they decided to test him. Lord Hargrove, the evening's host, stood near the center of the ballroom beside a cluster of politicians whose collective wealth could purchase a small country. His face drained of color so quickly it looked like someone had opened a vein beneath his collar. Hargrove. Cadric's voice carried no warmth. It carried no malice either. It carried something worse. Indifference laced with absolute control. I heard you've been entertaining conversations about my shipping contracts. Fascinating. I didn't realize you'd developed a taste for self-destruction. Lord Hargrove attempted a laugh. The sound came out fractured, a glass cracking under pressure it was never built to withstand. Your Grace, this is hardly the venue for— You chose the venue when you hosted Lucienne at your estate last Thursday. Cadric let the words settle like smoke. Don't look surprised. I own the man who drives your carriage, Hargrove. I own the woman who launders your bed sheets. You think I need an invitation to know what happens inside your walls? Silence swallowed the ballroom whole. Cadric studied the man the way a surgeon studies a limb he's already decided to amputate. Not with cruelty, with clinical precision. The distinction mattered because cruelty required emotion, and Cadric Blackthorne had burned emotion out of his operating vocabulary before he turned 25. Or so he believed. Cancel your arrangement with my cousin, Cadric said quietly. Do it tonight. Because if I return to this conversation, Hargrove, I won't be speaking. I'll be signing documents. And you know exactly what my signature does to men who disappoint me. He turned and walked toward the far corridor without waiting for a response. Behind him, the ballroom remained paralyzed for 11 full seconds before the first whisper broke loose, then another, then a flood of hushed voices trading the same terrified observation. He's back. The corridor beyond the ballroom stretched long and cold, lined with portraits of Hargrove ancestors whose combined accomplishments amounted to inheriting money and dying with it. Cadric's reflection ghosted across darkened window glass as he walked. Tall, sharp-jawed. Black hair swept back from a face that looked carved from something harder than bone. His eyes sat deep, the color of Atlantic storms, and they held the permanent expression of a man who had witnessed enough ugliness to stop flinching at any of it. He reached the servants' staircase and descended into the belly of the estate where no aristocrat was expected to walk. The kitchen staff scattered when they saw him. A footman dropped a tray of silver. Cadric ignored all of it and pushed through the rear door into the November air. Cold hit his lungs like a blade. He stood motionless in the alley behind Hargrove House, letting the temperature strip away the suffocating theater of the ballroom. His hands flexed at his sides, once, twice. A habit he'd carried since the war, since nights spent gripping weapons in trenches where survival was not a philosophical concept but a physical act repeated every 60 seconds until dawn. That was dramatic, even for you. The voice came from the shadows near the carriage house. A man stepped forward, lean and composed, wearing the uniform of a private secretary, though everything about his posture suggested military discipline. This was Mercer. No surname offered, none requested. He had served Cadric for 9 years with the loyalty of a man who understood that his employer's enemies rarely enjoyed long retirements. Lucienne's moved faster than we projected, Mercer continued, falling into step beside Cadric as they walked toward the waiting carriage. He secured pledges from at least 4 houses, possibly 6. Whitmore's name came up twice during the Hargrove dinner. Whitmore. Cadric repeated the name like he was tasting something rotten. The Marquis who collects wives the way children collect dead insects, pins them down, watches them stop moving. What Ji Swan? The same. He's been courting Hargrove aggressively. There's talk of a marriage arrangement. Kedrick stopped walking. The alley was narrow and dark, and smelled of horse dung and coal smoke and the particular rot that lived beneath London's perfumed surface. Whose marriage? Whose? Mercer produced a folded document from his coat. Lord Ashcombe's daughter, Lady Eveline. Ashcombe's drowning in gambling debts. He's offered her to Whitmore in exchange for financial rescue. The arrangement was supposed to be finalized last week, but the girl refused, publicly. At the Pemberton dinner, in front of 40 guests. Something flickered across Kedrick's expression. Not interest. Not yet. Something closer to recognition. The specific recognition of a creature who fights back when cornered rather than folding into submission. She refused a Marquis in front of 40 witnesses. Told him she'd sooner sleep in a gutter than share a bed with a man who smelled like his own cruelty. Direct quote, apparently. Ciao? Ischi molto. Kedrick almost smiled. Almost. The muscles around his mouth shifted by perhaps a millimeter before discipline crushed the impulse flat. And now? Vanished. Ashcombe's hired investigators. Whitmore's hired worse. The girl's somewhere in East London, but nobody's been able to pin her down. She's either very clever or very lucky. Lucky people don't survive East London. He climbed into the carriage. The interior was unadorned. No velvet cushions, no gilded fixtures, just dark leather and efficiency. Kedrick had stripped every carriage, every room, every possession in his life down to function because ornamentation was a lie that comfortable men told themselves, and Kedrick Blackthorne had never been comfortable. Not in his father's house, where silence meant someone was about to bleed. Not in the military, where he'd learned that the distance between living and dying was exactly one heartbeat of hesitation. Not in the duchy that sat on his shoulders like a yoke forged from the bones of every Blackthorne who came before him, each one more vicious than the last. Each one a reminder that his bloodline did not produce good men. It produced effective ones. The carriage lurched forward into London's fog. "There's something else," Mercer said from the opposite seat. His voice carried the particular weight it only carried when delivering information he knew Kedrick would not enjoy. "Your cousin is using the Ashcombe situation. He's positioning Whitmore as an ally. If Whitmore secures the Ashcombe girl through marriage, it consolidates resources Lucien can leverage against you in Parliament. The shipping contracts become secondary. This becomes a direct challenge to your seat." Kedrick stared through the carriage window at London sliding past like a wound that refused to close. Gaslight bled through fog. Shadows moved between buildings. Somewhere in this rotting labyrinth of poverty and ambition, a woman who had publicly humiliated a Marquis was hiding among people who had never seen the inside of a ballroom. He thought about power. He thought about it constantly, not because he loved it, but because he understood it the way a man who's been bitten understands the anatomy of the animal that bit him. Power was not a throne. It was not a title or a fortune or a name painted on the side of a ship. Power was the willingness to act when everyone else was still calculating consequences. It was the ability to enter a room and make 300 people forget how to breathe. And it was slowly killing him. He had known this for years. Known it since the night he stood in his father's study at Blackthorne Keep and watched the old Duke sign a document that would bankrupt a tenant farmer and his entire family over a boundary dispute worth less than a single bottle of the wine sitting on the desk. His father had not looked up, had not paused, had signed with the casual efficiency of a man swatting a fly, and then he had looked at his son and said the words that Kedrick carried like shrapnel, lodged too deep to extract. "Sentiment is a disease, boy. It makes you hesitate. Hesitation makes you vulnerable. And vulnerable Blackthorns end up in the ground." His father was in this ground now. Heart failure at 61, though Kedrick suspected the old man's heart had failed long before his body caught up. His mother had preceded him by a decade, wasted away in a wing of the keep that smelled like laudanum and regret. A woman who had entered the Blackthorne name beautiful and sharp and full of fight, and had been ground down to powder by a machine that consumed everything soft. Kedrick had inherited the machine. And for 3 years he had run it with the same merciless efficiency his father demanded. expanded the shipping routes, crushed competitors, collected debts from men who thought their titles made them untouchable. He had become exactly what the Blackthorne legacy required. Then he had walked away, not dramatically, not publicly. He had simply transferred operational authority to a skeleton staff, informed Mercer that he would be unreachable, and enlisted in the military under a dead man's name, Captain Rowan Vale, a ghost from the Crimean records whose paperwork Aldrich had purchased from a corrupt clerk for £12. War was supposed to be penance. Instead, it became the first honest thing he had ever experienced. Bullets did not care about bloodlines. Shrapnel did not negotiate. Men died beside him whose names the world would never remember, and their deaths meant more than every parliamentary session Aldrich had ever attended, because at least those deaths were real. At least in war, the violence was not dressed in silk and called civilization. He came back different, harder in some ways, fractured in others. The scars on his body mapped a geography of near misses that he sometimes traced in the dark when sleep refused to come, which was most nights because men who've killed at close range do not sleep easily, and men who've killed at close range and then returned to the world of ballrooms and brandy do not sleep at all. Now Lucian was forcing his hand, dragging him back into the machinery he had abandoned, and Aldrich felt the old mechanisms engaging inside him like rusted gears grinding back to life, each rotation stripping away another layer of whatever fragile humanity he had managed to reconstruct during his years as a soldier. "Pull resources from the Liverpool office," Aldrich said, his voice flat and operational. "I want everything on Lucien's movements for the past 6 months. Financial records, correspondence, who he meets, where he sleeps, what he eats for breakfast, and who cooks it." Already started. But Aldrich, and find the Ashcombe girl. Sit. Mercer paused. It was a brief pause, barely a fraction of a second, but Aldrich noticed because he noticed everything, and Mercer's pauses were never accidental. "May I ask why?" "Oh, because Whitmore wants her, and anything Whitmore wants is something I can use." But ye papes por mis. The words came out clean and strategic and completely devoid of whatever unnamed thing had stirred in his chest when Mercer described a woman who chose a gutter over submission. Aldrich recognized the deflection for what it was. He was skilled at lying to everyone. Lying to himself was simply the most practiced version. The carriage turned east. London changed within 3 streets. The gaslit facades of Mayfair dissolved into narrow lanes, where buildings leaned against each other like drunks, holding each other upright. The air thickened with coal smoke and the sweet, sick smell of the Thames at low tide. Children appeared and disappeared in doorways like feral animals adapted to darkness. This was the London that existed beneath the London of ballrooms, and it was more honest in its brutality because at least here, the predators did not pretend to be anything else. Aldrich knew these streets, not from aristocratic tours of charitable concern, but from the years he had walked them as Rowan Vale, a scarred captain with no title and no fortune and no name worth remembering. He had eaten in the workhouses, slept in barracks that smelled like sweat and gangrene, sat in church basements where wounded soldiers traded stories that would make Parliament vomit into their brandy snifters. And somewhere in this maze, a woman was hiding. He told himself his interest was strategic, told himself that Evelyn Ashcombe was a chess piece on a board where Lucian and Whitmore were making moves that required counter-moves, told himself that finding her, protecting her, potentially marrying her, all fell within the cold calculus of political warfare that had governed Blackthorne decisions for 2 centuries. He told himself all of this, and some of it was even true. 3 days later, Aldrich stood inside a church basement in Whitechapel wearing the uniform of Captain Rowan Vale. The uniform still fit. That bothered him more than it should have. It meant his body had not changed since the war, which meant the war had not ended. Not really, not in the places that mattered. The fabric sat against his shoulders with the weight of a second skin, familiar and confining and strangely liberating all at once. As Rowan Vale, he did not carry the Blackthorne name, did not carry the accumulated debt of a dynasty built on calculated ruthlessness. He carried only what a soldier carried, the weight of what he had done and the uncertainty of what came next. The basement was damp and cold and lit by oil lamps that painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. Wooden benches lined the walls. A table near the far end held bread, thin soup, and tea that tasted like boiled sadness. Wounded soldiers sat in clusters, some missing limbs, some missing the particular light behind the eyes that distinguishes living men from men who merely continue to exist. Kedrick had visited places like this dozens of times during his years as Vale. The military did not care for its broken instruments. It used them, discarded them, and manufactured new ones. The men in this room were the discard pile, and they knew it, and that knowledge sat on their faces like a permanent bruise. He was pouring tea for a one-armed corporal named Sully when he heard her voice for the first time. "You're pouring it wrong." He turned. She stood 3 feet away, holding a stack of folded bandages against her chest. Average height, dark hair pinned back in a style that suggested function over vanity. A dress that had been repaired so many times, the original fabric was more memory than material. But her face stopped him. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, in the particular way that faces become beautiful when they belong to people who have stopped trying to make them beautiful. It was her expression. She looked at him the way soldiers look at unfamiliar terrain, assessing, calculating distances, identifying exits. "There's a correct way to pour tea," he said. "There's a correct way to do everything. You're tilting the pot too far forward. The spout drips. Sully's bandages get wet. Wet bandages on an open wound breed infection. Infection in a place with no proper medicine means he loses the arm he has left." She set the bandages down on the table with precise movements. So yes, there's a correct way to pour tea. Sully grinned from his bench. "She's been terrorizing us like this for 2 weeks, Captain. Absolute menace. Won't let a man die in peace. Dying in peace is a luxury," she said without looking at Sully. Her eyes remained on Kedrick, measuring him. "You don't die in peace. You die from neglect because someone couldn't be bothered to pour tea without making a mess." Kedrick set the teapot down. He studied her the way he studied everything, with the detached precision of a man cataloging threats and assets simultaneously. She was younger than he expected, mid-20s. Her hands were rough in places where aristocratic hands were never rough, which meant she had been actually working, with the physical commitment of someone who understood that survival was not a concept, but a daily practice. But her voice betrayed her. The vowels were too clean, the syntax too structured, the way she deployed logic like a weapon rather than a tool. This was not a woman born to church basements and charity work. This was a woman trained in drawing rooms and debate, who had stripped away everything decorative and kept only what cut. "You're not from Whitechapel," he said. Her jaw tightened, a small movement, a fortification being raised. "And you're not from whatever regiment that uniform pretends you belong to." The words landed like a slap, accurate and unforgiving. Kedrick felt something shift inside his chest. Not alarm, not attraction, something more dangerous. Recognition. The specific recognition of a creature whose survival instincts matched his own. "What makes you say that?" "Your boots are military issue, but they're broken in wrong. A man who actually marched in those would wear the sole down on the outside edge from formation walking. Yours are worn center. You walk like you own ground, not like you march across it. And you hold yourself like someone accustomed to being obeyed, which is different from someone accustomed to following orders." Silence. Sully whistled low through his teeth. "Told you, Captain. Absolute menace. Kedrick looked at this woman, this Eveline Ashcombe, whom Mercer's operatives had been combing East London to locate for 3 days, and he felt the architecture of his plan shift beneath his feet like a floor giving way. He had come here to find a chess piece, a strategic asset to be positioned against Whitmore and Lucian, a woman desperate enough to accept protection from a stranger and pliable enough to serve Blackthorne interests without asking difficult questions. He had not come here to find someone who could read him through his disguise in under 2 minutes. "Rowan," he said, extending his hand. "Captain Rowan Vale." She looked at his hand the way she might look at a loaded weapon offered handle first, suspicious of the gesture, aware of what the mechanism could do if turned the wrong direction. "Evelyn," she said finally. No surname. The omission was deliberate and obvious and told him everything about how completely she had severed herself from the Ashcombe name. She shook his hand once, brief, firm, then withdrew as if prolonged contact was a vulnerability she could not afford. "You're good with the wounded, Kedrick said, gesturing toward the room. "How long have you been here?" Long enough to know that half these men will be dead before spring because the people who sent them to war can't be troubled to bring them back from it. She picked up the teapot and poured for Sully with a tilt so practiced the spout did not produce a single excess drop. And you? What brings a captain with expensive boots and no regiment to a church basement in Whitechapel? Maybe I came for the tea. The tea is terrible. Maybe I have low standards. Men with your posture don't have low standards. They have agendas. The corporal laughed into his cup. Eveline did not smile. She delivered the observation with the same clinical detachment Aldrich recognized in himself, the ability to dissect a situation while remaining emotionally uninvested in the findings. It was a survival mechanism. He knew because he had built the same one, brick by brick, in the years after his mother's death, when he realized that caring about anything inside Blackthorne Keep was equivalent to handing his father a weapon. Fair enough, Aldrich said. I have an agenda. My agenda is that Sully doesn't die from a wet bandage. Evelyn studied him for 3 more seconds. Then she turned back to her work. Make yourself useful, then. The medical supplies in the corner need sorting. Anything expired goes in the bin by the door. Anything salvageable goes on the shelf, organized by function. And don't just stack things, label them. These men deserve to know what's being used on their bodies. It was not a request. It was a command issued by a woman who had learned to disguise authority as practicality, and Aldrich obeyed it, not because he was playing a role, but because something inside him responded to competence the way starving men respond to bread, automatically, without the luxury of deliberation. He spent 4 hours sorting supplies while Eveline moved through the basement like a field commander managing triage. She changed bandages with hands that did not shake. She argued with a drunk surgeon who arrived late and reeking of gin, telling him that if he touched another patient in his condition, she would break his fingers personally. And the way she said it made Aldrich believe she meant it literally and possessed the specific rage required to follow through. She sat beside a dying soldier whose name nobody else remembered and held his hand without speaking until his breathing stopped. And when she stood up, her face held no tears. Only the compressed fury of a woman who understood that grief was not a feeling. It was evidence. Evidence that the systems designed to protect people had failed so completely that the only response left was to become the system yourself. Aldrich watched all of this from across the room while pretending to organize laudanum bottles. And he felt the plan fracturing further with each observation, because Eveline Ashcombe was not a chess piece. Chess pieces did not reorganize medical supply chains, or threaten surgeons, or hold dying men's hands with the particular tenderness that only people who have been abandoned understand how to offer. She was something else entirely, something his strategic mind could categorize, but his chest could not, because the feeling she generated had no place in the Blackthorne vocabulary. It was not desire, though desire lived somewhere inside it. It was not admiration, though admiration circled its edges. It was the devastating recognition that this woman had built herself into exactly what he had been trying to become for years. A person who refused to break even after the world made breaking the rational choice. He returned the next day, and the day after that. Each visit, Aldrich arrived as Rowan Vale and disappeared further into the role, not because the disguise required effort, but because the disguise required none. Rowan Vale was the man Aldrich wished he had become, a soldier with no empire to protect, no bloodline to honor, no legacy of calculated cruelty whispering in his ear that sentiment was a disease. Rowan Vale could sit in a church basement and sort bandages and pour tea without a single soul in the room calculating how to use him or destroy him. And Evelyn spoke to Rowan Vale in ways that no person had ever spoken to Duke Aldrich Blackthorne. She argued with him. Not the performative disagreement of nobles positioning themselves over dinner, but genuine, unvarnished intellectual combat. She challenged his opinions on military strategy, told him his understanding of wound care was medieval, mocked his inability to fold a bandage properly, and once, during a particularly heated exchange about whether the government bore responsibility for wounded veterans, she called him a sentimental fool with a savior complex and insufficient understanding of bureaucratic violence. He had never been called a fool by anyone. He found it intoxicating. But Evelyn did not give her trust easily. She gave it in fragments. Like a person handing over pieces of a weapon, she was still deciding whether to aim. Over days, Aldrich assembled these fragments into a picture that made the protective machinery inside his chest grind harder with each new detail. Her father had begun selling her future when she was 16. The first arrangement fell through when the prospective groom discovered the Ashcombe debts were larger than advertised. The second ended when Evelyn told the man during their engagement dinner that she would rather set herself on fire than spend a lifetime smiling at someone who discussed women like livestock. Her father had struck her for that one. Not hard enough to leave visible marks, just hard enough to communicate that her opinions were a defect he intended to correct through repetition. Whitmore was the third attempt, and the worst. The Marquis had visited the Ashcombe estate twice before the public arrangement, and both times Eveline had felt something in his presence that she described to Cadric without drama or self-pity. He looked at me the way your hands look at a bandage before you tear it, like I was material, like whatever shape I came in didn't matter because he was going to reshape me anyway. Cadric listened to this while rain hammered the basement windows, and his hands gripped his knees beneath the table hard enough to leave bruises on his own skin. He said nothing, because what could Rowan Vale say that would matter? He was a captain with no resources and no influence and no ability to destroy the Marquess of Whitmore. But Cadric Blackthorne could destroy Whitmore before breakfast. The contradiction was a blade turning slowly inside him. Every day he spent as Vale deepened the deception. Every conversation with Evelyn built a structure of trust on a foundation of lies. She was falling, not into romance, but into something more dangerous. She was beginning to rely on him, to seek his presence not as comfort, but as evidence that decent men existed, that the world contained at least one person who did not view her as currency. And he was not that person. He was exactly the kind of man she had fled. A duke who operated through power and possession and the calculated deployment of resources. A man whose first instinct upon learning of her existence was to assess her strategic value. The fact that he now felt something beyond strategy did not erase the strategy. It complicated it. And complications in the Blackthorne world had historically resolved in only one direction, toward damage. 3 weeks into his visits, Eveline arrived at the basement with a bruise on her jaw and fear behind her eyes that she was working very hard to disguise as anger. What happened? Kedric's voice came out in a register he did not recognize, low, controlled. The voice of a man holding something explosive with very careful hands. Nothing. That's not nothing. That's a fist, he shabbed. It's a reminder. She set her supplies down with movements that were too precise, too controlled, the mechanical choreography of someone refusing to let their hands shake. My father's investigators found me. 2 men. They came to the boarding house where I sleep. The landlady turned them away, but not before one of them grabbed my face and told me that running was a temporary arrangement. Cadric stood very still. The basement around him seemed to contract, the walls pulling inward, the air thinning, the oil lamps dimming as if the room itself was responding to whatever was building inside his body. It was not rage. Rage was too simple a word. It was the particular fury of a man who has spent his life as a predator, suddenly discovering what it feels like to want to protect something, and finding that the protective instinct is more violent than the predatory one ever was. Do you know their names? Why? What would you do, Captain? March to their employer with your impressive posture and politely request they leave me alone? She smiled, but the smile was a wound. I appreciate the concern, Rowan, I do. But I've learned that concern for men without power is just a nicer version of helplessness. And helplessness doesn't stop fists. The words cut him in places he did not know still bled, because she was right. Rowan Vale was helpless. Rowan Vale could do nothing against investigators hired by a desperate lord and backed by a marquis with resources and ruthlessness and the full machinery of aristocratic entitlement. But Cadric Blackthorne could make those investigators disappear so thoroughly that their own mothers would forget they existed. That night he sent Mercer. He did not send him with instructions to threaten or intimidate. He sent him with documents. Ownership records for the building where Ashcombe's lead investigator rented office space. Employment histories that revealed the second investigator's involvement in a fraud case that had been quietly buried 3 years earlier. Financial records showing that both men had accepted payment from sources connected to smuggling operations along the southern coast. Within 48 hours, both investigators had abandoned the Ashcombe assignment. One fled to the countryside, the other booked passage to France. Neither understood exactly what had happened. They only understood that continuing to pursue Lady Evelyn Ashcombe had suddenly become the most dangerous decision of their professional lives. Cadric felt no satisfaction. only the grim recognition that he had used Blackthorne power to protect a woman who trusted him specifically because she believed he possessed no such power. The deception was metastasizing. Every kind act committed as Rowan Vale was underwritten by the Duke's machinery. Every moment of authenticity contained a core of fraud, and the longer it continued, the more Kiedric realized he was not falling in love with Evelyn Ashcombe. He was falling into the first genuine terror of his life, because Evelyn represented something his entire existence had been engineered to reject. She was proof that strength did not require cruelty, that survival did not require the annihilation of tenderness, that a human being could be beaten and abandoned and hunted through the worst streets in London and still choose every single morning to walk into a room full of broken men and pour their tea without spilling a drop. She was everything the Blackthorne bloodline insisted was weakness. And Kiedric was beginning to understand that the Blackthorne bloodline was wrong about everything. On a Tuesday evening in late November, rain turned the streets of Whitechapel into rivers of black water. Kiedric and Eveline walked together through the downpour after leaving the church basement, sharing an umbrella that barely covered one of them, which meant Kiedric held it over her head and absorbed the rain across his shoulders without comment, because that was what Rowan Vale would do, and also what Kiedric's Blackthorne wanted to do. And the convergence of those two impulses terrified him. "You're getting soaked," Evelyn said. "I've been wetter. In the war. In the war. In the ocean. In several memorable incidents involving poorly constructed bridges." She almost laughed. The sound started in her throat and died before it reached her mouth. Killed by the habitual discipline of a woman who had trained herself not to display enjoyment because enjoyment had always been followed by something being taken away. "Can I ask you something?" "What?" she said. "You've been asking me things for 3 weeks without requesting permission first. This one's different." She stopped walking. Rain streamed down her face. Her eyes held the lamplight like dark mirrors. "Why are you here, Rowan? And I mean actually here, not the charitable explanation, not the story about duty and service. Why does a man who clearly doesn't belong in a church basement keep showing up to sort bandages and argue with me about tea?" "Oi, societis." Kiedric looked at her. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead. Water ran down his jaw in lines that traced the scar along his left cheek, the one he'd received outside Sevastopol when a piece of Russian shrapnel had attempted to remove his face and mostly failed. He should have lied. A strategic answer was readily available. Several, in fact. He could have deflected with humor, redirected with a question, constructed a plausible emotional narrative about seeking purpose after combat. Any of these would have maintained the architecture of deception. Instead, he told her the truth. Not the whole truth, not even most of it, but a piece of truth so raw and unguarded that it surprised him more than it surprised her. "Because you're the only person I've met in 10 years who makes me feel like the man I'm pretending to be might actually be the man I am." Evelyn stared at him through the rain. And for the first time since he'd met her, her expression held no assessment, no calculation, no measurement of threat or distance or exit strategy, just recognition. The kind that happens once and changes everything that follows. She reached up and touched the scar on his cheek. Her fingers were cold from rain and rough from weeks of physical work, and they trembled slightly, which told him that this gesture cost her something enormous. Because Evelyn Ashcombe did not touch people. She endured being touched. She permitted proximity when function required it, but she did not reach out first. She did not make herself vulnerable by choice. Until now. "You're a terrible liar, Rowan," she whispered. "I can see it in you. There's something you're not telling me, something big. And it scares me because I've started to care about what it is. And caring about men with secrets is how women like me end up destroyed." "I know," he said, and he meant it with every fractured piece of himself. "So whatever it is, whatever you're hiding, it better be worth what I'm risking by standing in this rain with you." He said nothing, because the truth was not worth it. The truth was a duchy and a title and a bloodline of monsters and a cousin plotting civil war and a web of political machinery that would consume her the moment it touched her. And none of that was worth what she was risking. But he could not walk away. That was the revelation that cracked Kiedric Blackthorne open like a fault line splitting stone. He had walked away from the duchy, walked away from Parliament, walked away from wealth and power and the accumulated machinery of 2 centuries of aristocratic dominance. He had walked away from everything. He could not walk away from her, and somewhere in the rain-soaked darkness of Whitechapel, in the space between Evelyn's cold fingers and the scar on his cheek, Duke Cadric Blackthorne understood for the first time in his life what his father had been warning him about. Sentiment was not a disease, it was a cage, and he had just locked himself inside it. Miles to the north, in a study lined with stolen documents and burning ambition, Lucian Blackthorne set down a letter bearing the seal of the Marquis of Whitmore. He smiled, the kind of smile that belonged on the face of something that fed in darkness and slept during the day. "So," he murmured to the empty room, "my cousin has found himself a weakness." He picked up a pen and began to write. The letter from Lucian Blackthorne reached the Marquis of Whitmore on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday evening, the machinery of destruction had already begun its slow, grinding rotation. Whitmore read the letter twice in his study at Grosvenor Square, a room decorated with the taxidermied heads of animals he had killed across 3 continents. The heads stared down with glass eyes that held more warmth than the man sitting beneath them. He was 52 years old, built like a dock worker forced into aristocratic tailoring, with hands that seemed perpetually clenched even when resting on the arms of his chair. His first wife had died in an asylum outside Bath. The official record cited nervous collapse. The unofficial record, whispered between servants who had since been paid or threatened into silence, cited something far more deliberate. A systematic campaign of isolation, control, and psychological dismemberment that had taken a vibrant 23-year-old woman and reduced her to a creature who flinched at the sound of her own name. Whitmore set down Lucian's letter and poured himself a brandy. "So the Duke is playing soldier in Whitechapel," he said to no one. The room absorbed his voice the way rooms absorb the voices of men accustomed to speaking without expecting responses. "And the Ashcombe girl has found herself a protector." He drank. The brandy was excellent. Everything in Whitmore's life was excellent, because excellence was the only standard he permitted, and anything that failed to meet that standard was either corrected or destroyed. Evelyn Ashcombe's refusal at the Pemberton dinner had not wounded his pride. Pride was a concept for men who needed external validation. What it had done was disrupt an arrangement, and disrupted arrangements were inefficiencies. And inefficiencies in Whitmore's world were treated with the same cold pragmatism a surgeon applied to gangrenous tissue. You cut them out. He picked up his pen and wrote 2 letters. The first to Lucian Blackthorne, confirming the alliance. The second to Lord Ashcombe, reminding him that debts did not disappear simply because daughters did. Then he rang for his valet and instructed him to prepare the carriage for a trip to the East End. He wanted to see this captain for himself. Across London, Cadric Blackthorne was discovering that the cage he had locked himself inside was shrinking by the hour. He stood in Mercer's operational quarters above a shipping office near the docks, studying a map of England's northern territories pinned to the wall with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign he was not certain he could win. Red pins marked properties Lucian had acquired or leveraged in the past 6 months. Blue pins marked allies still loyal to the Blackthorne seat. The red outnumbered the blue by a margin that would have alarmed a less disciplined man. "He's been busy," Cadric said. Mercer stood beside the window, watching the street below with the habitual vigilance of a man who had survived 9 years in Cadric's service by assuming every shadow contained a knife. Busy doesn't begin to describe it. Lucian's been building this for at least 2 years, maybe longer. The shipping contracts were just the surface. He's been buying loyalty in the northern parishes, placing his people in magistrate positions, financing local militias under the pretense of rural security. He's not trying to challenge your seat through Parliament anymore, Cadric. He's trying to make Parliament irrelevant. A private army. Nothing so crude. A network. Distributed authority. The kind of power structure that doesn't need a single leader because it's been designed to function without one. If you remove Lucian tomorrow, the machinery continues. That's the problem. Cadric traced a line on the map between 2 red pins. His fingers stopped at a point in the Scottish Highlands where Blackthorne Keep sat on cliffs overlooking the North Sea. Home. The word carried the weight of an anchor chained to his ankle, dragging him toward a depth he had spent years trying to escape. What about Whitmore? Mercer pulled a folder from his desk and set it on the map table. The Marquis has increased his financial exposure to Lucian's network by approximately £40,000 in the last quarter. exchange, Lucien has promised him favorable shipping terms through the northern routes, and more importantly, political cover for several transactions that would not survive scrutiny in the light of day. What kind of transactions? The kind that involve moving cargo that doesn't appear on any manifest through ports that don't officially exist. Keedrick's jaw tightened, not from surprise, from the particular disgust of a man watching his own family name being attached to operations that would have made even his father pause. The old Duke had been ruthless, but his ruthlessness operated within a framework. Rules existed, lines were drawn, not out of morality, but out of the pragmatic understanding that men who operated without limits eventually attracted the kind of attention that destroyed empires. Lucien had no framework. Lucien had appetite. "And the Ashcombe girl?" Mercer asked, not looking up from his papers. "You've been visiting Whitechapel every day for almost a month. I assume this is still strategic." The question hung in the air between them like a blade balanced on its point. "It's strategic," Keedrick said. "Of course it is." Mercer's voice carried no inflection. That was worse than sarcasm. Sarcasm could be dismissed. Neutrality from a man who knew you better than you knew yourself was a mirror you could not break. "I should mention that Whitmore sent 2 men to the Whitechapel area yesterday. Not investigators. Observers. They sat in a pub across from the church for 6 hours. Keedrick's hand stopped moving on the map. His entire body went still with the particular stillness of a predator registering a threat that has just crossed from theoretical to immediate. "They saw me. They saw Captain Rowan Vale enter and exit the church basement in the company of a woman matching Evelyn Ashcombe's description. Whether they connected Vale to you is uncertain. But if Whitmore shares that information with Lucien, and Lucien has anyone with enough intelligence to cross-reference Vale's military records, then the disguise collapses. Within days, possibly hours." Keedrick stared at the map. The red pins seemed to pulse in the lamplight, multiplying, spreading, consuming the blue with the inevitable patience of a disease that had been given too much time to metastasize. His mind processed scenarios the way it always processed scenarios, rapidly, clinically, stripping emotion from calculation the way a butcher strips meat from bone. Option 1. Abandon the Eveline operation, extract himself from Whitechapel, return to the duchy and engage Lucien through conventional political warfare. This option preserved the disguise and eliminated the vulnerability. It also meant leaving Evelyn exposed to Whitmore's reach with no protection and no warning. Option 2. Reveal himself to Evelyn. Bring her inside the Blackthorne machinery as an ally rather than an asset. This option preserved the relationship but destroyed the trust it was built on, because the moment she learned that the scarred captain who poured tea in her church basement was the most powerful duke in northern England, every word he had spoken would be retroactively poisoned by the deception. Option 3. Keedrick closed his eyes. His father's voice spoke from the dead space inside his memory where old wounds lived. "Sentiment is a disease. It makes you hesitate." Option 3. Marry her, quickly, under Vale's name if necessary. Create a legal bond that would complicate Whitmore's claim and Ashcombe's authority while simultaneously positioning Eveline within a protective framework that would survive the eventual revelation of his identity. It was manipulative. It was strategic. It was exactly the kind of calculated move that had defined Blackthorne men for 200 years, and Keedrick hated himself for how quickly his mind had generated it. "Increase surveillance on Whitmore's people," he said, his voice flat. "Operational. The voice of the Duke, not the captain. I want to know every move they make in the East End and prepare the Scottish route. If we need to move north quickly, I want the infrastructure ready." The Scottish route requires opening Blackthorne Keep. That means staff. That means visibility. Lucien will know within hours. Let him know. It's time he understood that I'm not hiding anymore. Mercer studied his employer for a long moment. In 9 years, he had seen Keedrick negotiate with cabinet ministers, dismantle rival shipping companies, and walk calmly through a barrage of enemy fire outside Sevastopol without altering his stride. He had never seen the particular expression currently occupying Keedrick's face. It was not determination. Determination was standard equipment. This was something raw, something that looked almost like desperation wearing the mask of resolve. "You care about her, Mercer said. Not a question. I care about the strategic position she represents. You care about her, and that terrifies you more than Lucian and Whitmore combined. Kedrick picked up his coat from the back of a chair. Prepare the Scottish route, Mercer, and keep your observations about my emotional state to yourself. He left the office and descended into the London night. The air was cold and wet and thick with the particular mixture of coal smoke and human density that made the city feel like a living organism slowly choking on its own waste. He walked east, toward Whitechapel, toward Eveline, toward the only place in London where the machinery inside his chest operated differently, where the gears turned toward something other than acquisition and defense and the endless calculation of threats. He found her outside the church, sitting on the stone steps despite the cold, reading a medical text by the light of a street lamp. Her breath made small clouds in the November air. She looked up when she heard his boots on the cobblestones and the change in her expression, the minute softening around her eyes, the slight release of tension in her shoulders, told him everything he needed to know about how deeply he had already embedded himself in her defenses. "It's nearly midnight," he said. "I'm aware of the time. Most people sleep at midnight. Most people haven't been informed that their father just doubled the reward for their return." She closed the book. Her movements were controlled, but her voice carried an edge that had not been there yesterday, sharper, more frayed, the voice of a woman whose margin of safety was eroding faster than she could reinforce it. £200, Rowan. My father is offering £200 to anyone who delivers me to his doorstep. Do you know what £200 means in Whitechapel? It means every person I've helped in that basement, every soldier I've bandaged, every landlady who's looked the other way, all of them are now doing arithmetic in their heads, calculating whether my trust is worth more than a year's wages. Kedrick sat beside her on the steps. The stone was freezing. He barely noticed. His body had been trained to ignore discomfort so thoroughly that comfort itself had become a foreign sensation, something he observed in other people the way a man born colorblind observes descriptions of red. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." The admission cost her something. He could see the price in the way her jaw tightened, the tendons in her neck pulling taut like cables bearing too much weight. Eveline Ashcombe did not say, "I don't know." She said, "Here's what we're doing." She said, "The system is broken, and here's how we fix it." Uncertainty was a luxury she had long ago categorized as unaffordable, and the fact that she was admitting it now, to him, in the cold dark of a Whitechapel street, meant she had reached a limit that scared her more than she was willing to show. "There's something else," she said. "A man came to the boarding house today. Not one of my father's investigators. Someone different, older, well-dressed. He didn't ask for me by name. He asked the landlady whether a young woman matching my description had been seen in the company of a military officer. He described you, Rowan. Your height, your scars, the way you walk." The temperature inside Kedrick's body dropped by several degrees. Not from the cold, from the precise, crystalline understanding that Whitmore had moved from observation to identification, that the perimeter around Evelyn was tightening, that the comfortable fiction of Captain Rowan Vale and his anonymous charitable work in a Whitechapel church basement had just developed a crack that would spread to fracture within days. What did the landlady say? She said she'd never seen anyone matching that description and charged him a shilling for wasting her time. Evelyn almost smiled. Almost. But he'll be back. They always come back, and eventually someone will talk. Because £200 is £200, and loyalty has a shelf life when people are hungry. Kedrick looked at her in the lamplight. Rain had started again, the fine, persistent London rain that didn't fall so much as materialize from the air itself, coating everything in a layer of cold moisture that seeped through clothing and into bone. Evelyn's hair was dampening. Her eyes held the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running long enough to understand that running is not a strategy, it's a delay. And in that moment, standing on the precipice between the man he was pretending to be and the man he actually was, Kedrick made the decision that would either save them both or destroy everything. "Marry me. Buy it." Eveline's entire body went rigid, not the softening into surprise of romantic fiction, the hard, sudden lock of every muscle group simultaneously, the autonomic response of a woman whose survival instincts had just detected something that could not be immediately categorized as safe or dangerous. What? Marry me. Tomorrow. I know a registrar in Southwark who doesn't ask questions and doesn't keep records that can be found. We sign papers, you become legally bound to a name that is not Ashcombe, and your father's claim evaporates. He can't force you home if home no longer exists on his terms. That's insane. That's tactical. You're asking me to marry you as a tactical maneuver? I'm asking you to marry me because every other option ends with you back in your father's house or in Whitmore's bed, and I will not stand here and watch either of those things happen. His voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, not visibly. A hairline fracture that only someone listening with the particular intensity that Eveline brought to every interaction would detect. But she detected it. He saw her detect it, saw the shift behind her eyes as she processed the sound and cross-referenced it against every other word he had spoken in the past month and arrived at a conclusion that he could not deny. "You mean that?" she said quietly. "I mean that. A marriage isn't something you mean, Rowan. It's something you live every day. In the same rooms, under the same name, with the same person, and I know almost nothing about you. I know you were a soldier. I know you pour tea badly and argue well and carry something behind your face that you won't let me see. But I don't know where you come from. I don't know your family. I don't know what you did before the war or what you plan to do after this, whatever this is." Every word she spoke was a nail being driven into the architecture of his deception. Each one accurate, each one deserved. She was not refusing him. She was demanding the truth that he was not prepared to give. And the distance between those two things was the distance between salvation and catastrophe. "There are things I can't tell you yet," he said. "Not because I don't trust you, because the information itself is dangerous. And I won't put you in that position until I can control the environment around it." "Control the environment? You sound like a general, not a captain." The observation landed closer to the truth than she realized, and Cadric absorbed the impact without flinching because flinching was the one reflex he had trained out of himself completely. "I sound like a man who knows what happens to people who aren't protected in a world that eats the unprotected alive." He took her hands. They were cold and rough and strong, and they fit inside his with a precision that felt engineered by something larger than coincidence. "I'm not offering you romance, Eveline. I'm not offering you a fairy story with a clean ending. I'm offering you a wall between you and the men who want to drag you back into a cage. And I'm asking you to trust me long enough to get behind it." Trust. She said the word like she was examining a piece of fruit for rot. "Trust is what my father asked for when he promised the first arrangement was for my benefit. Trust is what Whitmore smiled about when he told me our marriage would be a partnership. Men ask for trust the way thieves ask for open doors." "I know." "Then you know why I can't just hand it over because you asked nicely in the rain." "I'm not asking nicely. I'm asking desperately. There's a difference." She studied him for a long time. Rain fell between them. The street lamp flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a drunk was singing a song about a woman who waited for a sailor who never came home, and the melody drifted through the wet air like something that belonged to another century. "If I do this," Evelyn said finally, "and you're lying to me about who you are, if there's something underneath all of this that you're hiding, and it turns out that I've traded one cage for another, I want you to know that I will not collapse. I will not fold. I will not become the kind of broken thing that men like Whitmore manufacture. I will burn whatever we've built to the ground and walk through the ashes without looking back. Do you understand me?" "I understand you." "Say it like you believe it. I understand you, Evelyn. And if the day comes when you need to burn it down, I'll hand you the match." She held his gaze for 3 more heartbeats. Then she nodded. Once. The gesture of a woman signing a treaty she knew might be a trap, but had decided the alternative was worse. "Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow." They were married the following afternoon in a Southwark office that smelled like ink and mildew, and the accumulated desperation of every couple who had ever stood in that room making promises they were not certain they could keep. The registrar was a thin man with spectacles and a persistent cough who asked no questions, noted the names Rowan Vale and Eveline Ashcombe in a ledger that would later be retrieved and scrutinized by men with far more power than anyone in that room currently possessed, and pronounced them married with the enthusiasm of someone completing a shipping manifest. No flowers, no music, No family. Just two people standing in a government office while rain hammered the windows, signing documents that would reshape the architecture of their lives in ways neither of them fully understood. When they stepped outside, Evelyn looked up at the gray London sky and said, "Well, that was deeply unromantic." "Did you want romantic?" "I wanted honest. Unromantic will do as a substitute." They walked through Southwark in silence. The city moved around them with its usual indifference, carriages splashing through puddles, vendors shouting prices into the wet air, children darting between legs and lampposts. Two more anonymous figures in a city of 2 million, their new legal bond invisible to every person they passed. The anonymity felt like armor. Temporary armor, but armor nonetheless. Aldrich had arranged lodgings in a boarding house near the river, a place clean enough to be habitable and obscure enough to avoid immediate detection. The room was small. One bed, one window overlooking the Thames, a table, 2 chairs, the furnishings of a life stripped to essentials, which suited both of them in ways that more comfortable people would find difficult to understand. That first evening, they sat across from each other at the table eating bread and cheese that Aldrich had purchased from a vendor on the walk home. Home. The word felt foreign in his mind, a concept he had associated exclusively with Blackthorne Keep's cold corridors and his father's colder expectations. This room was not home, but Evelyn's presence in it made the air different, warmer, not comfortable exactly, but inhabited in a way that Aldrich's spaces had never been inhabited before. "Rules," Evelyn said, tearing bread with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to eat quickly because meals in precarious situations were never guaranteed. "If we're going to share a room, we need rules. I'm listening. 1. You sleep on the floor until I decide otherwise. 2. You don't touch me unless I initiate contact. 3. You don't lie to me. If there's something you can't tell me, you say you can't tell me. Silence is acceptable. Fabrication is not." "Agreed." 4. If at any point I feel unsafe in this arrangement, I leave. No discussion, no negotiation, no dramatic appeals to whatever protective instinct is currently driving your behavior. I walk out the door and I don't come back. "Agreed." 5. She paused, set down the bread, looked at him with an expression that was neither hard nor soft, but something in between. The expression of a woman allowing herself the luxury of vulnerability while keeping one hand on the emergency exit. "Don't make me regret this, Rowan. I'll do my best." "Your best better be exceptional." He slept on the floor that night. The boards were hard and cold and reminded him of barracks floors in the Crimea, which was strangely soothing because his body had been trained to find rest in discomfort the way other bodies found rest in softness. He listened to Evelyn's breathing in the darkness. Slow, measured. The breathing of someone who had taught herself to fall asleep in unsafe environments by controlling the one physiological function that was still within her power. And he lay there on the floor of a Southwark boarding house, this man who owned a castle and a fleet and enough wealth to purchase the entire street they were sleeping on, and he felt something he had not felt since the night he walked away from Blackthorne Keep. Freedom. Not the freedom of escape. That was what he had felt when he enlisted. This was different. This was the freedom of proximity to a person who demanded nothing from him except the truth, and the terrible, exhilarating knowledge that giving her that truth would either forge the strongest alliance of his life or annihilate the only thing he had ever chosen to care about. The days that followed existed in a suspended state between happiness and detonation. They fell into a routine that resembled normality, the way a ceasefire resembles peace. Mornings spent at the church basement, working side by side among the wounded soldiers who had become their shared project. Afternoons walking through London's streets, while Evelyn taught him things about the city's underbelly that even his intelligence network had missed. The boarding houses that doubled as unlicensed clinics, the networks of women who passed information about dangerous men through laundry routes and market stalls, the invisible infrastructure of survival that existed beneath society's polished surface. And Aldrich listened. Not with the strategic ear of a duke cataloging useful intelligence, though that ear was always present, always operational, always filing away details that might prove valuable in the war he knew was coming. He listened with something closer to hunger, the hunger of a man who had spent his entire life inside structures built by other people. structures of power and obligation, and inherited brutality, and was now witnessing for the first time the structures that people built when they had nothing except each other. Eveline was magnificent in these spaces. Not the polished magnificence of a duchess at a ball, but the rough, functional magnificence of a person operating at the exact limit of her capabilities and refusing to stop. She organized medical supply chains with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. She negotiated with landlords who charged wounded veterans triple rent. She argued with bureaucrats and won. She lost her temper with a gin-soaked doctor again, and this time actually grabbed the man's collar and shoved him against a wall and told him that if he showed up drunk one more time, she would ensure that every patient in the district knew his name, his address, and his particular fondness for charging dead men's families for treatments that were never administered. The doctor did not return drunk, and Cadric watched all of this and felt the Blackthorne machinery inside him grinding against something new, because Eveline wielded power without a title, without wealth, without the accumulated leverage of aristocratic machinery. She wielded it through competence and fury, and the absolute refusal to accept that broken systems were permanent conditions rather than problems waiting for someone stubborn enough to fix them. His father had told him that power came from making men afraid. Evelyn demonstrated that power came from making men irrelevant. But outside their suspended world, the machinery of destruction continued its rotation. Mercer arrived at the boarding house on a Tuesday evening, which was itself an alarming event, because Mercer never appeared in person unless the situation had escalated beyond the reach of written communication. Eveline was at the church. Kedrick opened the door and read the news on Mercer's face before the man spoke a single word. "How bad? Boss or mate?" "Lucian knows you're in London. He doesn't know about Vale yet, but he knows you're operational. He's accelerated his timeline. The Winter Assembly has been moved forward by 3 weeks. He intends to present his challenge to the Crown's representatives before Christmas." "That's not enough time to build a proper defense." "No, it's not, which is exactly why he moved it." Mercer stepped inside and closed the door. His eyes swept the small room with the automatic assessment of a man who evaluated every space for tactical advantages and found very few here. "There's more. Whitmore visited Ashcombe yesterday. They filed a formal petition to annul any marriage contracted by Evelyn on the grounds that she was not legally competent to consent, citing emotional distress and flight from lawful guardianship. She's 24 years old. She doesn't need her father's consent. She doesn't need it in law, but Whitmore isn't operating in law. He's operating in influence. The petition will go before a magistrate that Lucian appointed 6 months ago. The outcome is predetermined unless you intervene as Blackthorne, and the moment you intervene as Blackthorne, the connection between Rowan Vale and the Duke becomes public record. Kedrick stood very still in the center of the small room. The walls felt closer than they had 5 minutes ago. The ceiling lower, the air thicker. He was a man of extraordinary control, a man who had maintained composure under artillery fire and across negotiating tables where single words carried the weight of fortunes. But in this moment, in this rented room that smelled like damp wood and river fog, he felt the architecture of his control developing stress fractures, because every option led to the same destination. Revelation. The collapse of the Vale identity. The exposure of the deception that sat at the foundation of every interaction he had shared with Evelyn over the past month. And once she knew, once she understood that the man who slept on her floor and poured her tea and argued about medical supplies in a church basement was the Duke of Blackthorne, the most feared aristocrat in northern England, the man whose family name was synonymous with the exact kind of calculated power she had spent her life running from. He could not finish the thought, not because he lacked imagination, but because the potential outcomes were so catastrophic that his mind, trained to process worst-case scenarios without flinching, simply refused to complete the calculation. "Prepare Blackthorne Keep," he said. "Full staff. Open the north wing, and send word to every ally we have left in Scotland that the Duke is returning." Mercer nodded. "And Evelyn?" "I'll tell her tonight." "Which part?" Kedrick looked at his most trusted operative, the only man alive who understood the full scope of the deception and its implications. "All of it." Mercer left without another word. He had served Kedrick long enough to recognize the particular tone of voice that accompanied decisions that could not be reversed. It was the same tone Kedrick had used the night he decided to leave the duchy. The same tone he had used the morning he enlisted. A frequency that existed beyond determination, beyond resolve, in the territory where a man accepts that the next action he takes will permanently alter the landscape of his life and chooses to take it anyway. Eveline returned at 9 o'clock. She came through the door carrying the cold of the streets on her clothes and the weight of another day's work on her shoulders. Her hands were raw from washing bandages. Her hair had escaped its pins. She looked exhausted and fierce and entirely unprepared for what was about to happen. "There's soup," Kedrick said, from the vendor on the corner. "Is it the good vendor, or the one who waters everything down?" "The good one." She sat at the table and ate with the focused efficiency he had come to recognize as her default mode. Fuel for function, nothing wasted. He sat across from her and did not eat and did not speak and waited for her to notice the silence, which she did after approximately 90 seconds, because Evelyn noticed everything. "What's wrong?" He looked at her. At this woman who had married a stranger in a government office to escape a cage and had somehow, impossibly, made him feel more human in 4 weeks than he had felt in 34 years of living. At her raw hands and her sharp eyes and the line of her jaw that tightened whenever she sensed danger, which was tightening now, right now, because she could read the weather in his expression the way sailors read the weather in clouds. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and when I'm done, you're going to want to leave. I'm asking you to hear everything before you decide." Her spoon stopped moving. She set it down with the careful precision of a person placing a weapon within reaching distance. "Talk." "My name is not Rowan Vale." Silence. Not the comfortable silence of two people who have run out of things to say. The pressurized silence of a room in which the air itself has become hostile. Vale was a dead soldier whose identity I purchased from a military clerk. I used his name and his commission to enlist, to disappear, to become someone other than who I was born. Evelyn's face did not change. That was worse than any reaction. A change would indicate processing. The absence of change indicated something deeper. A lockdown. A sealing of every emotional entry point with the instantaneous efficiency of a fortress under siege. "Who were you born?" He held her gaze, held it the way a man holds the pin of a grenade he has already decided to pull. "My name is Kedrick Blackthorne. I am the Duke of Blackthorne. I own estates across northern England and Scotland, control shipping routes through the North Sea, and hold enough political influence to reshape parliamentary votes. The man who has been sleeping on your floor for the past 2 weeks is one of the most powerful men in Britain." Eveline did not move, did not blink, did not breathe as far as he could tell. She sat perfectly still at the table in their small rented room while the words settled around her like ash from a fire she had not seen coming. Then she stood up, slowly, with the mechanical precision of someone whose body was operating on instructions issued before the mind had finished processing the information it had just received. She walked to the window, looked out at the Thames. The river was black and swollen with rain, and it moved past the building with the indifferent force of something that had been flowing long before London existed and would continue flowing long after London was gone. "You lied to me." Yes, every day, every conversation, every time you sat in that basement and poured tea and told me stories about your regiment and your wounds and your life as a soldier. All of it. The wounds are real. The soldier was real. The man who sat in that basement, don't. The word came out like a blade being drawn. Don't you dare tell me the man was real while the name was fake. As if identity is something you can separate from the actions performed under it. You walked into my life wearing a dead man's name, and you let me trust you, and you let me marry you, and you did all of it, knowing that everything I believed about you was constructed on a lie. I did, Het. Why? She turned from the window. Her eyes were dry. That was the most terrifying thing Kedrick had ever witnessed. More terrifying than artillery. More terrifying than Lucian's political machinery. More terrifying than anything the Blackthorne legacy had ever produced. Because women who cry when betrayed are processing grief. Women who don't cry when betrayed are processing strategy. Because I came to Whitechapel to find you. Because my cousin is trying to seize the Blackthorne duchy. And your marriage to Whitmore would have strengthened his position. Because I initially viewed you as a strategic asset in a political war. Initially, before I knew you. Before I watched you hold a dying man's hand, before you told me about the bandages and the tea, before you became the only thing in my life that wasn't a transaction. Whoa, say shit, Yamakin. And now that I know, what am I now? A strategic asset with feelings? A chess piece that happens to be angry? You're the woman I'm asking to come to Scotland with me, not as a pawn, as my wife, my actual wife, standing beside me while I fight my cousin for control of a duchy that I don't even want but can't abandon, because abandoning it means Lucian wins. And Lucian winning means the people who depend on Blackthorne lands get crushed under the wheels of a man with no framework and no restraint. Evelyn stared at him from across the room. The space between them felt like a continent, like an ocean, like the particular distance that exists between two people when one of them has just discovered that the ground they were standing on was never solid. You should have told me. I know. Before the marriage. Before all of it. You should have walked into that basement the first day and said, "My name is Aldrich Blackthorne, and I need your help." Yam. And you would have run. You would have heard the title and the name and the power, and you would have seen every man who has ever tried to control you. And you would have vanished into London so completely that no one, not my operatives, not your father, not Whitmore, no one would have found you. You don't know that. I know you. I know you better than you want me to. And I know that you would rather die anonymous in a gutter than let another powerful man decide the shape of your life. The words hung between them. True, brutal, undeniable. Evelyn's breathing had changed, faster, shallower, the breathing of a person whose body was flooding with adrenaline while her mind fought to maintain the disciplined control that had kept her alive through every crisis of the past 6 months. Scotland, she said. Blackthorne Keep, it's the only position defensible enough to withstand what's coming. Lucian is moving against the duchy. Whitmore is moving against you. Your father has filed a petition to annul our marriage. If we stay in London, we lose on every front. And if I go with you to your castle, your duchy, your world, what happens to me there? You become the Duchess of Blackthorne. You stand beside me against everyone who wants to tear this apart. And you do it knowing exactly who I am, exactly what I've done, and exactly what it costs to carry the name you're inheriting. I didn't inherit it. You tricked me into it. Yes. And I will spend the rest of my life answering for that. But right now, tonight, the only question that matters is whether you're coming with me or walking out that door. Binds. Evelyn looked at the door, then at the window, then at the man standing in the center of the room who had been her husband for 2 weeks, and a stranger for even longer, and was now something she did not have a word for. Not enemy, not ally, not lover. Something that existed in the space between all categories, defying the organizational systems she had built to make sense of a world that had never made sense. When do we leave? Tonight? The carriage is already waiting. She laughed. The sound was sharp and bitter and carried no amusement whatsoever. Of course it is. Because dukes don't wait. Dukes prepare, dukes arrange. Dukes move the pieces into position and then inform the pieces where they're going. Evelyn, I'm coming with you. Not because I trust you. Not because I forgive you. Not because I believe a single word you've said about what I mean to you beyond strategy. I'm coming because the alternative is worse. Because my father is hunting me, and Whitmore is hunting me, and apparently your cousin is using all of it to destroy whatever empire your family built. And because somewhere underneath the lies and the manipulation and the decades of Blackthorne brutality you carry in your blood, I saw something real in that church basement. And I'm angry enough to find out whether it actually exists or whether you manufactured that too. She walked to the bed, began packing the small bag that contained everything she owned. Her movements were sharp and efficient and furious. Aldrich watched her and felt the full weight of what he had done settle onto his shoulders with the crushing permanence of stone. He had gained what he needed. She was coming to Scotland. She would stand beside him against Lucienne. The strategic position was secured, and the woman he had married would never look at him the same way again. The carriage was black and unmarked and waiting in the alley behind the boarding house. Mercer stood beside it with 2 armed men whose postures communicated professional violence with quiet efficiency. Evelyn's eyes moved over the armed escort without surprise, without fear, with the cold assessment of a woman recalibrating her understanding of exactly how much power the man she had married actually possessed. "Your Grace," Mercer said as Cadric approached. Those two words. Eveline heard them, and her spine straightened by a fraction of an inch, and something behind her eyes hardened into a material that Cadric recognized because he saw it in his own reflection every morning. The look of a person building armor in real time, constructing defenses against a threat that has already penetrated every wall they previously trusted. She climbed into the carriage without assistance, sat in the far corner, pressed herself against the wall as if maximizing the physical distance between herself and Cadric within the confined space. He climbed in after her. The door closed. The carriage lurched northward. Outside, London began to recede. The gaslit streets thinning, the buildings spacing farther apart, the city loosening its grip mile by mile as the countryside opened up around them, dark and vast and indifferent. Inside the carriage, two people sat in silence. One a duke returning to claim a throne he never wanted. The other a woman trapped inside a name she never chose. And somewhere ahead of them, through miles of darkness and approaching winter, Blackthorne Keep waited on its cliffs above the sea. Stone and iron and 2 centuries of accumulated power, rising from the Scottish coastline like a monument to everything Evelyn had spent her life trying to escape. She was heading straight into the heart of it, and there was no road back. The carriage reached the Scottish border on the 3rd night, and Evelyn had not spoken a full sentence to Cadric in 47 hours. She communicated in fragments. Functional exchanges stripped of everything human. Water. "Stop here." "How far?" The words came out flat and mechanical, delivered without eye contact, without inflection, without the particular sharpness that had defined every interaction between them since the day she corrected his tea-pouring technique in a Whitechapel basement. That sharpness had been a form of intimacy, Cadric realized now, a willingness to engage. Its absence was not silence, it was amputation. He sat across from her in the carriage and felt the distance between them like a physical wound, a gap in his chest where something had been removed without anesthetic. 3 feet of leather and air separated their bodies. 3 feet that might as well have been the Atlantic, because Evelyn had constructed a barrier out of stillness and controlled breathing that no amount of proximity could penetrate. Mercer rode ahead with the armed escort. Cadric had instructed him to send riders to Blackthorne Keep with advance notice of their arrival. The machinery was moving, staff being assembled, rooms being prepared. The great house awakening from its years of dormancy like a beast shaking off hibernation, hungry and disoriented and dangerous in the way that all powerful things are dangerous when they've been neglected too long. Outside the carriage windows, England gave way to Scotland in increments. The hedgerows thinned, the hills swelled and darkened. Stone walls replaced fences, running across landscapes that looked like they had been carved by something older and less forgiving than human hands. The sky lowered until it pressed against the earth like a lid being sealed. Eveline watched all of it with the expression of a woman memorizing terrain, not admiring it, cataloging it, identifying landmarks, noting distances between settlements, calculating, even now, even inside this rolling cage, how far she would need to run and in which direction if the situation demanded it. Cadric recognized the behavior because he had performed it himself. Every room, every building, every landscape. The soldier's reflex of mapping exit routes before the shooting starts, because the shooting always starts, and the men who survive are the ones who decided where to run before the first bullet found its target. "We'll arrive by morning," he said. She did not respond, did not look at him, did not acknowledge the words with even the minimal courtesy of a nod. He let the silence remain. Not because he accepted it, but because he understood that silence was the only currency Evelyn currently possessed, and forcing her to spend it on conversation she had not chosen would be an act of theft committed by a man who had already stolen enough. The carriage climbed through the night. The roads narrowed. The horses strained against gradients that grew steeper with each mile. Cold seeped through the walls of the carriage with the persistent determination of something that had been waiting outside for a very long time and intended to get in regardless of barriers. Cadric did not sleep. He had not slept since the night he told her the truth. His body, trained through years of combat to function on deprivation, operated now in the same heightened state it had occupied during the war. Every sense amplified, every nerve conducting information at speeds that made normal thought feel sluggish. His mind ran calculations continuously, not strategic calculations now, but something more desperate, more human. The calculus of damage assessment. How much had he broken? How much could be repaired? Whether the structural integrity of what existed between them was compromised beyond recovery or merely fractured in ways that time and pressure could seal. He did not know the answer. That was the most disorienting part. Aldrich Blackthorne had spent his entire adult life operating within systems he could predict and control. Political systems, financial systems, military systems. Systems governed by rules that, once understood, could be manipulated with precision. Eveline existed outside every system he had ever encountered. She operated according to an internal logic that he could observe but not decode, predict but not direct. And the helplessness that generated was a sensation so foreign to his experience that his body processed it as physical threat, flooding him with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Dawn broke gray and violent over the Scottish coastline. Evelyn saw Blackthorne Keep for the first time through a curtain of sea mist, and the sound she made was not a gasp. Not a word. It was a single sharp intake of breath, the sound of a person's body responding to a threat that the mind has not yet fully processed. The keep erupted from the clifftop like something that had been forced upward through the earth by geological violence. Black stone walls rose 80 feet from foundations that merged with the cliff face itself, making it impossible to determine where natural rock ended and human construction began. Towers punctured the cloud line at 3 points along the eastern wall. Iron gates the height of 4 men stood between pillars carved with the Blackthorne crest, a design that had been deliberately stripped of all ornamentation until only its essential elements remained. A raptor, talons extended, descending. The gates opened as the carriage approached, pulled by chains that groaned with the metallic protest of mechanisms built to outlast the people who operated them. Beyond the gates, a courtyard of fitted stone stretched toward the keep's main entrance, where a line of servants stood in formation despite the freezing mist and the pre-dawn darkness. They were waiting for the Duke. The carriage stopped. Mercer opened the door. Cold air flooded the interior with the particular savagery of Scottish coastal wind, a cold that did not simply lower temperature but actively attacked warmth, stripping it away layer by layer until the body understood that comfort was a concept the landscape did not recognize. Aldrich stepped down first. His boots struck stone. The sound echoed across the courtyard with the weight of return, of reclamation, of a prodigal inheriting a kingdom he had tried to refuse. The servants bowed. Every head dropped simultaneously, a choreographed display of deference performed by people whose employment depended on their ability to make submission look voluntary. Your Grace. The head steward, a man named Aldrich, who had served the Blackthorne household for 31 years, stepped forward with the rigid formality of a soldier presenting for inspection. Welcome home, sir. The north wing has been prepared as instructed. Staff is assembled. The kitchens are operational. Aldrich nodded once. Then he turned and extended his hand toward the carriage. Eveline stood in the doorway. The wind caught her hair and whipped it across her face. She looked at the keep, at the servants, at the courtyard, at the gates, at the cliffs falling away to the sea beyond the eastern wall, and on her face was an expression that Aldrich would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. Not fear. Evelyn did not do fear. It was the look of a woman standing at the threshold of a world that was built to consume people like her, and deciding, in real time, whether to step forward or step back. She ignored his hand, climbed down unassisted, planted her feet on Blackthorne stone and straightened her spine and looked at the assembled servants with the same clinical assessment she had directed at every new environment she had entered since fleeing her father's house. "Which one of you is in charge of medical supplies?" she said. The servants exchanged glances. Aldrich's composure flickered, a hairline crack in 31 years of professional blankness. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "Medical supplies. Bandages. Laudanum. Surgical tools. This building has 100 rooms and sits on a cliff in the middle of nowhere. Someone here is responsible for keeping people alive when they get hurt. I want to meet that person within the hour." She walked past Aldrich without waiting for a response and entered Blackthorne Keep as if the building were a church basement in Whitechapel and she were late for a shift. Aldrich watched her disappear through the entrance. Something inside his chest shifted. Not the grinding of machinery, something quieter. Something that felt dangerously close to the thing his father had warned him about. He crushed it, sealed it behind the same wall that contained every other vulnerability he could not afford. Then he turned to Mercer. Where's Lucien? Edinburgh, as of last night. He has rooms at the Caledonian and has been meeting with Crown representatives ahead of the Winter Assembly. And Whitmore? Traveling north. Our sources put him 2 days behind us. He's not alone. He has Ashcombe with him. Kedrick processed this information with the cold efficiency that had made him effective at war and unbearable at peace. Evelyn's father was coming to Blackthorne Keep, coming to claim his daughter from inside the walls of a castle whose master had just revealed himself to be the kind of powerful man Evelyn had spent her life running from. The irony was not lost on him. It was lodged in his throat like a bone. Double the perimeter guard. No one enters the estate without my direct authorization. And get me everything we have on Lucian's Crown representatives. I want to know who's been bought and who's still available. The first 3 days at Blackthorne Keep passed in a state of armed detente. Eveline occupied the Duchess's chambers in the north wing, a suite of rooms that overlooked the sea and had not been inhabited since Kedrick's mother had died in them 18 years earlier. The rooms had been cleaned and aired and furnished with new linens, but the walls still held the particular atmosphere of spaces where unhappiness had been the primary resident. Eveline felt it immediately. Kedrick knew because she asked Aldrich within 2 hours of arrival what had happened to the previous Duchess. She passed, Your Grace, some years ago. How? Aldrich's face performed the complicated maneuver of a servant deciding how much truth a new mistress was entitled to. She was unwell for some time before the end. Unwell how? I'm afraid the specifics are not... The specifics are exactly what I'm asking for, and I'll keep asking until someone in this building decides that the new Duchess is worth an honest answer. What happened to her? Aldrich looked at the floor, at the walls, at the window, at every surface in the room except the face of the woman asking the question. She grew isolated, Your Grace. The keep is remote. The Duke, the previous Duke, was not a man given to companionship. She had no visitors in her final years. The isolation affected her health significantly. Eveline absorbed this information and filed it in whatever internal archive she used to catalog the ways in which powerful men destroyed the women who stood beside them. She dismissed Aldrich without further questions. Then she sat on the edge of the bed where Kedrick's mother had slowly vanished from the world and stared at the stone walls and breathed with the controlled rhythm of a woman running calculations she did not want to complete. Kedrick knew all of this because the keep was his, and the keep reported to him, and information flowed through Blackthorne's walls the way blood flows through a body. Aldrich reported the conversation within the hour. The chambermaid noted the Duchess's appetite, or lack of it. The groundskeeper tracked her walks along the cliff path, always alone, always facing the sea, always stopping at the same point where the path narrowed, and the drop to the rocks below became vertical. She was measuring the cage, learning its dimensions, testing its walls, and Kedrick watched the reports come in and felt a terror that was entirely new to his vocabulary. Not the terror of battle, which was physical and immediate and could be survived through training and reflex. This was the terror of watching a person you have harmed navigate the architecture of that harm with the precise, methodical intelligence of someone who will find every structural weakness and use them, when the time comes, to either escape or demolish. On the fourth day, he went to her. She was in the library. Blackthorne Keep's library occupied the entire second floor of the West Tower, a cavernous space lined floor to ceiling with books accumulated over 2 centuries, many of which had never been read because Blackthorne men did not generally value knowledge for its own sake. They valued it as leverage. Information was a weapon, and the library was an armory. And Eveline had apparently been conducting a thorough inventory of its contents since her arrival. She sat at the central table surrounded by ledgers and estate records and shipping documents that she had no authorization to access, but had apparently obtained through a combination of direct requests and the specific force of personality that made people hand over things they had been told not to hand over. These numbers don't add up, she said without looking up when Kedrick entered. Your northern shipping revenue shows a 40% decline over the past 2 years, but your operational costs have remained flat. Either someone is stealing from the estate or the accounting is deliberately obscured to hide losses. Kedrick stopped 3 steps inside the library. He had come here to talk about their situation, about the approaching threats. about the need for some functional alliance between them that would allow them to present a united front against Lucien and Whitmore and the gathering storm of the Winter Assembly. Instead, he found his wife conducting a financial audit of his duchy. "How did you get those ledgers?" I asked Aldrich. Aldrich doesn't have authority to release financial records. Aldrich doesn't have authority to refuse his duchess. The statement landed with the precision of a chess move that simultaneously defended territory and attacked on a different front. Evelyn was staking a claim, not to the marriage, not to the relationship, to the infrastructure. She was inserting herself into the operational machinery of Blackthorne Keep, the way she had inserted herself into the medical supply chain of a Whitechapel church basement, through competence so undeniable that resistance became irrational. Edric pulled a chair from the table and sat across from her. The same configuration as the Southwark boarding house. The same table between them. But the table was now mahogany instead of pine, and the room was a castle library instead of a rented room, and the distance between them had calcified into something that furniture arrangement could not bridge. "The accounting discrepancy is Lucian's work," Edric said. "He's been siphoning resources from the shipping operations to fund his network in the northern parishes. I've known about it for months. I haven't stopped it because stopping it would have required revealing that I was monitoring the duchy, which would have alerted him to my return before I was ready." Eveline looked up from the ledger. Her eyes held the same flat assessment she had directed at him in the Whitechapel basement. No warmth, no hostility, just the pure, uncontaminated process of one intelligence evaluating another. "You let your cousin steal from you as a strategic maneuvers. I let my cousin believe he was stealing from me. There's a difference. Every transaction he routed through the shipping operations left a paper trail. Those trails are now documentation of criminal activity that I can present at the Winter Assembly. And you didn't think to share this information with your wife? The woman who is apparently now the Duchess of this empire you're fighting to keep? I'm sharing it now. Now. After I found it myself. After I spent 2 days going through records that you could have walked me through in an hour. You're still managing information, Edric. Still deciding what I'm allowed to know and when I'm allowed to know it. You traded one disguise for another. The captain's uniform for a duke's selective honesty. The words cut with surgical precision. Not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. And accuracy from Evelyn was always more dangerous than anger, because anger could be weathered, but truth had to be absorbed. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right. That's not the point. The point is that you're sitting in this chair having the same internal debate you've had since London. How much truth does she get today? How much can I control the flow? How much can I parcel out without losing the strategic advantage of knowing more than she does?" She closed the ledger with a sound like a door shutting. She closed the... I grew up watching my father play that game. I know exactly what it looks like from the other side of the table. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me everything. Not the curated version, not the strategically advantageous version. Everything. Lucian's plan, Whitmore's involvement, your counter strategy, the financial situation, the military situation if there is one, and judging by the men I've seen patrolling the grounds, there is one. All of it, right now. Or I walk out of this library and begin conducting my own investigation. And I promise you, Edric, I will find things you don't want me to find. Because this building is full of people who are more afraid of being useless to the new Duchess than they are of being disloyal to the old Duke. Edric looked at her across the mahogany table, at the set of her jaw, at the tension in her shoulders that spoke of a body coiled for combat, at the eyes that held no forgiveness but held something that might, under extreme pressure and over considerable time, evolve into something adjacent to it. And he made a decision that violated every principle the Blackthorne dynasty had operated under for 200 years. He told her everything, not the curated version, not the strategically advantageous version. Everything. Lucien's network in the northern parishes, the militia financing, the shipping fraud, the forged documents being prepared for the Winter Assembly, Whitmore's involvement and the nature of the cargo being moved through unlisted ports, the names of allies and the names of enemies, and the names of the men who existed in the gray space between, whose loyalty was a commodity available to the highest bidder. He told her about his father, about the document that bankrupted the tenant farmer, about the words that had shaped his operating philosophy since childhood. Sentiment is a disease.
Bye-bye.
He told her about his mother's decline, about the laudanum and the isolation and the slow erasure of a woman who had entered the Blackthorne name believing it was a partnership and discovering too late that it was a sentence. He told her about the war, not the heroic version, the real version, the version where men screamed for hours after shrapnel opened their bodies, where he had killed at distances close enough to feel the heat leaving the other man's flesh, where he had made decisions about which wounded soldiers to save and which to leave behind based on calculations of strategic value that reduced human lives to resource allocation problems. He told her about this night he decided to leave the duchy. Sitting alone in the study where his father had signed the document, staring at the same desk, holding the same pen, and understanding with absolute clarity that if he stayed, the machinery would consume him the way it had consumed his father and his grandfather and every Blackthorne before them. That the title was not an inheritance, it was an infection, and the only treatment was amputation. He told her everything, and when he finished, the library was dark. Hours had passed. The fire in the hearth had collapsed to embers. The sea wind screamed against the tower windows with the particular fury of Scottish winter storms that arrived without warning and left without apology. Evelyn sat in silence for a long time. Her face moved through expressions that Aldrich could not read, which was itself remarkable because he could read every face he encountered. This woman had become his blind spot, the one person whose internal landscape he could observe but not map. "Your mother," she said finally. "What was her name?" The question caught him in a place he had not expected to be caught. A place below the strategic calculations and the political warfare and the dynasty management. A place where a boy had watched a woman disappear by degrees and done nothing because he was 12 years old, and the machinery was already too large and too fast, and too thoroughly integrated into the structure of his world. Margaret Blackthorne. Evelyn said the name like she was weighing it, measuring it against her own experience of powerful men and the women they consumed. "And you think you're different from your father?" "I don't think I'm different. I think I'm trying to be different. The distinction matters. It matters to you. It doesn't matter to the woman sitting in your mother's room, sleeping in your mother's bed, wondering whether the isolation that killed her is a feature of this building or a feature of the Blackthorne bloodline." He had no answer for that, because the honest answer was both. He had no answers for, and Eveline deserved better than honesty that confirmed her worst fears. The alliance that formed between them was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was the cold, pragmatic recognition of two people trapped inside the same fortress with enemies approaching from every direction who understood that survival required cooperation regardless of the damage existing between them. They worked. That was the framework. Work became the neutral territory where trust could function without requiring the emotional infrastructure that Aldrich had destroyed. Eveline threw herself into the estate's operations with an intensity that left the staff simultaneously terrified and devoted. She reorganized the household accounts, identified 3 members of the kitchen staff who had been reporting to Lucian, and dismissed them with the specific, cold efficiency of a woman who understood that mercy toward spies was cruelty toward everyone the spies endangered. She established communication with tenant farmers across the Blackthorne lands, visiting them personally despite the winter weather, listening to their grievances, cataloging their needs, building a network of loyalty that operated not through fear, but through the revolutionary concept of actually caring whether people survived. Aldrich watched this and felt 2 things simultaneously: admiration that bordered on awe, and the grinding, corrosive guilt of a man watching the woman he had deceived prove that she was better at his job than he was. On the 7th day, Whitmore arrived. The Marquis came with a convoy of 3 carriages, an armed escort of 8 men, and Lord Ashcombe, who looked like a man being transported to his own execution. They arrived at midday under a sky so gray and low it seemed to be pressing the landscape flat. Mercer reported their approach an hour before they reached the gates, giving Aldrich time to assemble the specific theater of power that the situation demanded. When Whitmore's carriage passed through the iron gates of Blackthorne Keep, Aldrich was standing in the center of the courtyard, alone. No servants flanking him, no armed guards visible. Just a man in a black coat standing on stone with the wind tearing at his hair and the castle rising behind him like an extension of his body. The message was deliberate. "I don't need an army to receive you. I am the army. Whitmore stepped down from his carriage with the physical confidence of a man whose size and wealth had combined to create a lifetime of unopposed movement through the world. He was larger than Aldrich, broader. His hands were the hands of a man who enjoyed physical dominance as a recreational activity. His eyes swept the courtyard, the castle, the cliffs, the sky, with the appraising calculation of someone estimating the market value of everything he saw. Blackthorne. His voice carried the same quality as his presence, heavy, occupying more space than necessary. Last time I stood in this courtyard, your father was alive. The place had more warmth. My father's warmth was a performance. You of all people should know the difference. Whitmore smiled, the smile of a man who interprets hostility as entertainment. I'm here for the girl, Blackthorne. You know that. I know that. Let's not waste each other's time with territorial displays. She's not a girl. She's the Duchess of Blackthorne. And you're standing in her courtyard making demands that I find personally offensive and strategically ill-advised. Lord Ashcombe emerged from the second carriage. He looked like a man whose skeleton had been replaced with something less rigid, stooped, diminished. His eyes carried the particular vacancy of a person who has handed operational control of his life to someone more powerful and is now merely a passenger in his own decisions. I want to see my daughter, Ashcombe said. The words came out thin and reedy, a voice that had once commanded drawing rooms and now sounded like it was being generated by a mechanism running low on fuel. Your daughter is inside. Whether she wants to see you is her decision, not mine and not yours. She is my child. She is my wife. And the documents you filed to annul that marriage will be challenged by every legal mechanism available to the Blackthorne estate, which I assure you, Lord Ashcombe, is a considerable number of mechanisms. Whitmore had been watching this exchange with the amused patience of a man observing a chess game whose outcome he believes is already determined. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Aldrich to a span that most men would register as a threat. Aldrich did not step back, did not adjust his posture, did not exhibit any physical indication that Whitmore's proximity registered as anything other than an inconvenience. Here's what's going to happen, Blackthorne. Whitmore's voice dropped to a register intended for private delivery, a voice used in rooms where agreements were made that could not survive public scrutiny. You're going to release the girl to her father. The marriage will be annulled on grounds we've already established with a magistrate who understands the situation. In exchange, I will withdraw my financial support from your cousin's challenge at the Winter Assembly. Lucian loses his primary backer. You keep your duchy. Everyone gets what they want. Except Evelyn. Evelyn gets stability, security, a position in society that your impulsive little rescue operation has thoroughly destroyed. I'm offering her restoration. You're offering her a cage with better furniture. And what are you offering her, this fortress on a cliff? A husband who lied about his name, his title, and his identity for a month? At least I was honest about what I am. The words landed because they were designed to land. Whitmore had not survived decades of aristocratic warfare by accident. He knew where the vulnerabilities were. He had been briefed, likely by Lucian, on the nature of Aldrich's deception and its impact on the marriage. He was wielding that information now with the precision of a man driving a blade into the exact spot where the armor was weakest. Aldrich felt the impact, absorbed it, filed it in the same internal compartment where he stored every wound that could not be addressed in the moment of its infliction, later. He would process it later, if later ever came. You have 1 hour to rest your horses, Aldrich said, his voice carrying the temperature of the Scottish wind. Then you leave my estate. Evelyn stays, the marriage stands. And if you set foot on Blackthorne land again without invitation, I will treat it as an act of aggression and respond accordingly. He turned and walked toward the keep's entrance. Whitmore's voice followed him across the courtyard. You're making an enemy you can't afford, Blackthorne. Not with the assembly 3 weeks away, and your cousin counting the votes to bury you. Aldrich did not respond, did not turn, did not break stride. He walked through the entrance of Blackthorne Keep and felt the iron doors close behind him with the sound of a position being fortified. Inside, Evelyn was standing at the top of the main staircase. She had watched the entire exchange from the window of the upper gallery. Her face held an expression that Aldrich was learning to identify as the specific combination of anger and assessment that preceded her most dangerous decisions. My father looks terrible, she said. Your father is a weak man being operated by a strong one. Whitmore is using him as a legal instrument. The petition to annul our marriage originates with Ashcombe's name, but was drafted by Whitmore's solicitors. I know, I read the filing. Mercer had a copy in his office. I helped myself. Of course she did. Whitmore offered a deal, Aldrich said. You in exchange for withdrawing his support from Lucian. I heard. These walls carry sound better than you think. She descended 3 steps, stopped. The staircase placed her above him. A physical arrangement that she had chosen deliberately because Eveline understood the semiotics of spatial positioning as instinctively as Aldrich understood the mechanics of political warfare. And what did you tell him? I told him to leave, without consulting me. There was nothing to consult. The answer was no. The answer was no because you decided it was no, not because I decided it was no. You stood in that courtyard and made a declaration about my future without asking me whether I agreed with it. Again. The same pattern, the same assumption that your judgment supersedes my autonomy because you're the Duke and the castle is yours and the power is yours and therefore the decision must be yours. The alternative was handing you to Whitmore. The alternative was walking downstairs and standing in that courtyard and telling Whitmore myself, to his face, with my own voice, the way I told him at the Pemberton dinner, the way I've been telling men like him my entire life. I don't need you to speak for me, Aldrich. I needed you to not lie to me. You failed at that. Don't compound the failure by assuming I need your protection more than I need my own agency. She continued down the stairs, past him without pausing, and walked toward the library with the stride of a woman who had decided that the most effective response to powerlessness was the immediate acquisition of information. Aldrich stood alone in the entrance hall of Blackthorne Keep, beneath the oil portraits of his ancestors, and felt the full weight of the paradox that was grinding him to powder. He had built his entire life on control. Control of territory, control of assets, control of information, control of the men and women who operated within his sphere. And the one person he could not control was the one person whose respect he needed more than the duchy itself. He was still standing there when Mercer appeared from the servants' corridor. We have a problem. The words carried a frequency Aldrich had never heard in Mercer's voice. Not urgency. Something beyond urgency. Something that sounded almost like fear, and Mercer did not experience fear the way normal men experienced fear. Mercer experienced tactical concern. This was different. What kind of problem? Mercer handed him a letter. Sealed. The seal was Blackthorne. Not Aldrich's seal. The older version. The one his father had used. The one Lucien had apparently adopted as part of his campaign to claim the duchy's legacy. Aldrich broke the seal. Read the contents. Read them again. His face did not change. His body did not move. But something behind his eyes went dark, like a light being extinguished in a room that had already been dim. When did this arrive? Iskido, 20 minutes ago, by writer from Edinburgh. The writer was one of ours, Aldrich. One of our own men carried this letter into the keep. Aldrich read the letter a 3rd time. The words did not change. They sat on the page with the permanent, immovable finality of sentences that cannot be unwritten. Lucian had obtained the records of every financial transaction Aldrich had executed as Rowan Vale. Every payment to landlords in Whitechapel who sheltered Eveline. Every purchase of medical supplies routed through military contacts. Every operational expenditure that connected the fictitious captain to the Blackthorne treasury. The paper trail that Aldrich had believed was buried beneath layers of operational security had been excavated, documented, and compiled into a formal accusation of fraud, identity theft, and misappropriation of ducal funds for personal purposes. But that was not the problem. The problem was the source. The documents had been provided to Lucian by someone with access to Blackthorne's internal financial records. Someone who knew where the money moved and how it moved, and which ledgers contained the entries that connected Vale to Blackthorne. Someone who had been inside the machinery long enough to understand its architecture and ruthless enough to sell that architecture to the enemy. Mercer's name was on 3 of the documents, not as a source, as an authorizing signature. Transactions he had approved on Aldrich's behalf during the months in London. Transactions that could only have been retrieved by someone with direct access to Mercer's operational files. Who? Cadrick's voice came out in a register that Mercer had heard exactly once before. On a night in the Crimea, when their position had been betrayed and 17 men had died in an ambush that should have been impossible. I have 3 candidates, all with access, all with motive. Mercer's jaw was tight. His eyes held the specific fury of a man whose professional competence has been violated in the most personal way possible. But there's a faster way to narrow it down. The documents include transaction dates and amounts that only appear in one set of records. The private ledger, the one I keep in the locked cabinet in my quarters, which means someone accessed your quarters. Which means someone I trusted enough to leave alone in my quarters is working for Lucian. Kedrick folded the letter, placed it in his coat. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. Every external indicator suggested a man operating within normal parameters. But inside, in the space where the machinery of the Blackthorne mine performed its calculations, something had gone profoundly wrong. A gear had shattered. A load-bearing wall had cracked. The structure that held everything together, the structure built on the assumption that the innermost circle was secure, that the people closest to the center could be trusted because their survival depended on the center holding, was fracturing in real time. His father had told him that sentiment was a disease. His father had been wrong about many things, but right about the underlying principle. Not sentiment, trust. Trust was the disease. Trust was the vulnerability that allowed a man to believe that the walls around him were solid when in fact they had been hollowed. Out from inside by someone patient enough to wait and ruthless enough to strike when the timing inflicted maximum damage. The winter assembly is in 19 days, Cadrick said. Lucien will present these documents publicly. Combined with the forged treason charges, he'll argue that I abandoned the duchy, committed fraud under a false identity, married illegally, and misused Blackthorne funds to finance a personal relationship. The Crown's representatives will have no choice but to open a formal inquiry. And during that inquiry, Lucien will move to install himself as acting duke. We can challenge the documents, argue they're fabricated. They're not fabricated, they're real. Every transaction is real. Every signature is real. The only thing Lucien has added is the narrative, and the narrative is damning because it's true. Mercer stood very still, the realization settling into his body like cold water filling a sinking vessel. They had been outmaneuvered, not by superior strategy, not by greater resources, by the simple, devastating mechanism of betrayal from within. Find the source, Cadrick said, before the assembly. I need to know who, and I need to know everything they've given Lucien. Everything. Because if there's more, if there are documents we haven't seen, then we're not fighting an accusation. We're fighting an execution. Mercer left. His footsteps echoed down the corridor with a rhythm that sounded different than it had that morning. Faster, harder. The footsteps of a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath his feet contained a hole he had not seen. Kedrick stood alone in the entrance hall. Above him, the portraits of his ancestors looked down with painted eyes that had witnessed 2 centuries of Blackthorne power and Blackthorne cruelty and Blackthorne survival. His father's portrait hung at the center of the collection. The old Duke's expression was exactly as Cadrick remembered it. Not cruel, not kind, simply certain. The certainty of a man who understood that the world operated on a single principle, and the principle was this: everything you build can be taken from you by the people you allowed inside. Cadrick had allowed people inside. He had allowed Evelyn inside his disguise, had allowed Mercer inside his operations, had allowed the staff of Blackthorne Keep inside the daily mechanisms of his return. And somewhere in that chain of allowances, someone had turned his access into a weapon and aimed it at the foundations of everything he was trying to hold together. He walked to the window. The courtyard below was empty. Whitmore's carriages were gone. The gates were closed. The wind screamed across the cliff top with the sound of something tearing apart. 19 days until the assembly. A traitor inside his walls. His cousin armed with the truth. His wife armed with a fury he had earned. And the dawning, devastating understanding that the man who had survived wars and destroyed rivals and controlled an empire, through sheer force of will, was now facing the one scenario that no amount of power or precision could resolve. He could not fight this as the Duke his father raised. The Duke his father raised would seal the keep, would interrogate every member of the staff with methods that did not require consent. would burn the documents and silence the source and meet Lucian at the assembly with a combination of forged counter-evidence and purchased loyalty that would bury the challenge under enough procedural weight to collapse it. That was the Blackthorne way. The old way. The way that had preserved the dynasty for 2 centuries and destroyed every person who had come close enough to be damaged by it. Kedrick looked at his own reflection in the window glass, saw the face of a man standing at the exact point where 2 versions of himself met and could no longer coexist. The Duke who ruled through fear and control and the surgical removal of every vulnerability. And the man who had walked into a church basement in Whitechapel and discovered that vulnerability was not weakness, but the cost of admission to the only kind of life worth living. He could not be both. The assembly would come. The accusations would land. Lucien would present documents that were true and damning and irrefutable. And in that moment, Kedrick would either respond as a Blackthorne, with manipulation and force, and the annihilation of anyone who stood in his path, or he would respond as the man Evelyn had challenged him to become. A man who told the truth, even when the truth was a weapon aimed at his own chest. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, and behind him, in the library of Blackthorne Keep, Evelyn turned a page in the estate ledger and found an entry that made her stop breathing. A payment. Large. Routed through a channel she had not seen before. Authorized by a signature she recognized. Not Mercer's. Not Kedrick's. The signature belonged to Aldrich, the head steward, the man who had served the Blackthorne household for 31 years, the man who had welcomed them at the gates, the man who had stood in formation with the servants and bowed and said, "Your Grace," with the practiced deference of a lifetime of service, the man who had been inside the walls longer than anyone else alive. Eveline set down the ledger. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing steadied within 3 seconds. She stood from the table and walked to the library window and looked down at the courtyard where the head steward was directing the evening watch rotation with the calm authority of a man who had been managing this building's secrets since before Evelyn was born. 31 years inside the walls. Close enough to touch everything. Trusted enough to be invisible. She turned from the window, walked to the library door, and stopped. Because telling Kedrick meant trusting Kedrick. And trusting Kedrick meant accepting that the man who had lied about everything might be the only man capable of handling the truth. She stood in the doorway. The castle breathed around her. Stone and wind and centuries of accumulated power pressing against her from every direction. Then she moved. Toward him. Toward the man she had married and the war they had not chosen, and the enemy who had been standing beside them the entire time, bowing and smiling and waiting for the precise moment to drive the blade home. 19 days. And the walls of Blackthorne Keep had already been breached from within. Evelyn found him at the window. She did not announce herself, did not knock. She walked into the entrance hall carrying the estate ledger the way a soldier carries a weapon that has just misfired in his hands, with the careful grip of someone holding something that has already done damage and might do more. "Aldrich," she said. One word. The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. Kedrick turned from the window. His face was the face she had learned to read in increments over the past weeks, a landscape of controlled surfaces and buried fault lines. She watched the name register, watched it travel from his ears to his brain, to the place behind his eyes, where calculations happened at speeds that frightened people who were not accustomed to being around minds built for warfare. "Show me." She set the ledger on the windowsill and opened it to the page. The payment was large enough to be significant, and small enough to be hidden among legitimate operational expenditures. Routed through a supply account for the keep's maintenance, authorized by the steward's signature, directed to a receiving account in Edinburgh that Eveline had cross-referenced with 3 other documents from the library's financial archives. "The Edinburgh account belongs to a solicitor named Price," she said. "Price filed in corporation papers 6 months ago for a shipping venture backed by undisclosed investors. I found the venture's name in Lucian's correspondence files, the same files you told me about 3 days ago when you decided to be honest for the first time since I met you." Kedrick studied the ledger entry. His jaw worked beneath the skin, a small mechanical movement that betrayed the pressure building inside a structure designed to withstand enormous force. Aldrich, 31 years. The man who had served his father. The man who had stood at the gates and bowed and said, "Your Grace," with the weight of 3 decades of apparent devotion. How many payments? "Mors os chuvanji." 7 that I've found, spanning 14 months. Total amount just under £3,000. Enough to fund Lucien's legal preparation for the assembly and still leave a margin for whatever contingencies a man planning a coup requires. 14 months. Cadric repeated the time frame and Eveline watched the number land. 14 months meant the betrayal preceded his return. Preceded London. Preceded Evelyn. Aldrich had been feeding Lucien information while the keep sat dormant, while the Duke was a ghost wearing a dead man's uniform in the Crimean theater, while the machinery of the dynasty operated on the assumption that the innermost walls were sound. They were not sound. They had not been sound for over a year. And every decision made during that time, every calculation, every strategic move, had been executed inside a structure whose foundations were compromised. Cadric closed the ledger. His hand remained on the cover. Flat. Still. The hand of a man pressing down on something that might explode if he releases the pressure. You found this in 2 days. Bonnie. I found it because I wasn't looking for loyalty. I was looking for numbers. Numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers tell you what people actually did while they were lying. Didn't Bolsonaro say? He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she had not seen before. Not the controlled mask of the Duke. Not the fractured honesty of the confession in the library. Something raw and unprocessed. The expression of a man experiencing an emotion he has not had time to package into something manageable. Thank you. The words were simple, inadequate, and entirely genuine. Eveline heard the difference because she had spent a month learning to distinguish between Cadric's strategic communications and his actual ones, and this fell into the second category with the unmistakable weight of something that had bypassed every filter. Don't thank me. Use it. We have 18 days and a traitor in the house and a cousin with enough documentation to bury you. Gratitude is a waste of time we don't have. She turned and walked back toward the library. At the doorway, she stopped. Did not turn around. And Cadric, when you deal with Aldrich, I want to be in the room. Why? Because I'm the one who found him. Because this is my fight now, whether I chose it or not. And because I want to see with my own eyes whether you handled this like the man in the church basement or the man on these walls. She left. Her footsteps faded down the corridor. And Cadric stood in the entrance hall with the ledger in his hand and the full understanding that the woman he had married was not simply adapting to Blackthorne Keep. She was becoming the thing the Keep had needed for 200 years and never had. Someone who saw clearly. They took Aldrich that evening, not publicly, not dramatically. Mercer and 2 of his men intercepted the steward in the service corridor between the kitchens and the wine cellar. No violence, no restraint. Simply 3 men appearing in a narrow hallway with the specific body language that communicates to the recipient that the time for deception has ended. Aldrich's face when he saw them told the story before anyone spoke. Not surprise, not fear, resignation. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open and has finally heard the handle turn. They brought him to the study. Cadric's father's study. The room where the old Duke had signed the document that bankrupted the tenant farmer. The room where Cadric had decided to leave. The room where every significant Blackthorne decision for 3 generations had been made, and where the walls held the accumulated weight of choices that had shaped and destroyed lives with equal indifference. Cadric sat behind the desk. Evelyn stood near the window. Mercer positioned himself by the door. Aldrich was placed in a chair across from Cadric, with the deliberate staging of a man being seated for interrogation, which is precisely what this was. Silence filled the room like water rising in a sealed space. Aldrich looked at the desk, at the walls, at the portrait of the old Duke hanging above the fireplace. He did not look at Cadric, not at first. He looked at the room itself, as if the room were the entity he had been serving all along, not any individual man. "How long have you known?" Aldrich said. "Hours. My wife found the Edinburgh payments in the maintenance ledger." Aldrich's eyes moved to Evelyn. He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with something that looked almost like respect. "She's sharper than anyone this house has produced in a century. You should listen to her more than you do. We're not here to discuss my marriage. No. We're here to discuss my treason." Aldrich said the word without flinching, without apology, with the flat, matter-of-fact delivery of a man who has made his calculations and accepted the results. "Ask your questions, Your Grace. I'll answer them. I've been carrying this long enough. Cadric leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his hands folded, the posture of a man who has decided to listen before he decides what to break. Why? I'll say not. So, because your father destroyed this place. Aldrich's voice carried a weight that 31 years of accumulated observation had compressed into something dense and hard and irreducible. I watched him, every day, for decades. I watched him sign documents that ruined families, watched him dismiss servants for looking at him wrong, watched him turn your mother into a ghost, and then complain about the cost of her medicine. I stood in hallways and held doors open and said, "Your Grace 10,000 times while that man turned Blackthorne, keep, into a machine that consumed everyone who came near it." And Lucien is better? Lucien is different. Different was enough. Different how? He's running illegal shipping operations through unlisted ports. He's financing private militias. He's using forged documents to seize a duchy he has no legal right to. How exactly does that constitute improvement? Well, Aldrich's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his composure. Lucien promised reform, promised the tenants better terms, promised the staff protections that your family never provided, promised that the Blackthorne name would mean something other than fear. And you believed him. I believed him because believing him was easier than believing you. The words came out with a force that surprised even Aldrich. His eyes were wet now. Not from tears, but from the physiological pressure of 31 years of silence breaking open like an abscess. You left, Your Grace. You walked away from this place and everyone in it. You enlisted under a false name and fought in a war that had nothing to do with your responsibilities, and left the rest of us here, inside these walls, with no protection and no leadership and no one to answer to except the memory of a dead man who never gave a damn about any of us while he was alive. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cadric had ever heard, because Aldrich was right. Not about Lucien, about the abandonment. Cadric had walked away, had convinced himself that leaving was an act of rebellion against a toxic legacy when in reality it was. Also an act of abandonment of every person whose survival depended on the machinery he refused to operate. The tenants, the staff, the families who lived on Blackthorne land and ate Blackthorne bread and depended on the Blackthorne name for the thin margin of stability that separated their lives from destitution. He had abandoned them. And Aldrich, standing inside the walls he had served for 3 decades, watching the dynasty collapse in slow motion around him, had made the rational calculation that a new master was better than an absent one. Cadric looked at Evelyn. She stood by the window with her arms crossed and her face holding the expression he had come to recognize as her processing state, taking in information, running it through internal frameworks, arriving at conclusions she would deploy when the timing served the greatest strategic purpose. "What has Lucien received?" Cadric said, turning back to Aldrich. "Everything. I need a complete accounting. The financial records connecting Rowan Vale to Blackthorne treasury expenditures, correspondence between Mercer and your shipping agents, staff reports from the keep's reopening, the guest registry showing Whitmore's visit and the terms of his departure." Aldrich paused. "And the marriage certificate, the original document from the Southwark registrar. The marriage certificate. The single piece of paper that connected Eveline to Cadric through the fictitious name of Rowan Vale. In Lucien's hands, it was proof of fraud, proof that the Duke of Blackthorne had married under a false identity, rendering the union legally void and stripping Evelyn of the only protection the Blackthorne name provided. Cadric's hands unfolded on the desk. Slowly, deliberately, the hands of a man who is deciding between several courses of action and knows that the wrong choice will destroy everything. "Mercer," his voice was quiet, "take Aldrich to the North Tower. Private quarters. No staff contact. No communication. Comfortable, but contained." "Your Grace," Aldrich began, "you've served this house for 31 years. That is the reason you're being housed in quarters instead of a cell. Do not mistake leniency for forgiveness." Mercer escorted Aldrich from the study. The door closed. The room contracted around 2 people and the massive, suffocating weight of what had just been revealed. Evelyn spoke first. The marriage certificate. I know. If Lucian presents it at the assembly, the marriage is void. I'm no longer the Duchess of Blackthorne. I'm a woman who was tricked into a fraudulent union by a man using a dead soldier's name. My father's petition to annul is granted automatically. Whitmore, I know. Stop saying I know and start telling me what you're going to do about it. Edric stood from the desk, walked to the fireplace, stared at his father's portrait. The old duke stared back with painted eyes that held the same certainty they had held in life. The certainty that power was the only currency that mattered, and that sentiment was a disease that weakened the men who contracted it. The old way would be to destroy the evidence, send men to Edinburgh, find Lucien's copies, burn them, intimidate or eliminate anyone who had seen the documents, arrive at the assembly with clean hands and a clean narrative, and bury the challenge under procedural maneuvers and purchased votes. He could do it. The machinery existed. The men existed. The willingness, buried deep but still operational, existed. 2 centuries of Blackthorne methodology sat inside his bloodline like instructions encoded in bone, and all he had to do was follow them. But Evelyn was standing 6 feet away, watching him, measuring him against the same test she had issued in the library days earlier. The test of whether he was the man from the church basement or the man on these walls. And Kedrick understood, with the clarity that comes only when every option has been examined and every escape route has been sealed, that the answer to that test would determine not just the outcome of the assembly, but the entire remaining architecture of his life. I'm going to tell the truth, he said. Evelyn's expression did not change. What truth? All of it. At the assembly. In front of the Crown's representatives and every noble in Scotland. I'm going to stand up and confirm that I left the duchy. That I enlisted under a false name, that I married you as Rowan Vale, that I used Blackthorne funds to finance operations in London. Every accusation Lucian makes, I'm going to confirm. That's suicide. That's disarmament. Lucian's entire strategy depends on exposure, on the shock value of revealing secrets that I've been fighting to protect. If I reveal them myself publicly, before he can deploy them, the weapon loses its detonation. He's holding a gun loaded with truth. I'm going to fire it before he does. And then what? You've just confessed to fraud and identity theft in front of the Crown. What possible outcome survives that? The outcome where I'm standing in front of those people as a man who chose honesty over preservation. The outcome where Lucien's forged treason charges are exposed for what they are, because I've already accounted for every real transgression, making his fabrications obvious by contrast. The outcome where the Crown's representatives see a duke who came forward voluntarily versus a challenger who had to scheme and steal and bribe his way to a case. He turned from the portrait, faced her. His eyes held something she had not seen in them before. Not certainty, not control. Something that looked almost like faith, though faith was a word neither of them would use because faith implied trust in outcomes that could not be calculated. And both of them had been trained by their respective brutalities to trust only what could be measured. It's a gamble, Eveline said. It's the only play left. It could end everything. The duchy, the name, your position, mine. It could. Or it could do what Lucian never expected. It could turn the narrative. Because the one thing aristocrats respect even more than power is the willingness to risk everything when backed into a corner. It's the one move that cannot be faked and cannot be countered because it operates on a frequency that political machinery doesn't process. And what frequency is that? Desperation, the real kind. The kind that men exhibit when they've burned every bridge and torn up every map, and the only direction left is forward through whatever's waiting on the other side. Evelyn studied him for a long time. The fire crackled, the wind battered the windows. Somewhere deep inside Blackthorne Keep, the building settled on its foundations with the low groan of stone adjusting to weight it had been carrying for centuries. If you do this, she said, I stand beside you, not behind you, beside. And when you finish confessing your sins to the aristocracy, I speak, not you, not Mercer, me. Because the marriage certificate has my name on it too. And if anyone is going to explain why a woman signed a document in a Southwark office with a man she barely knew, it's going to be the woman who signed it. Evelyn, that's not a request. Bolts. He looked at her, at this woman who had walked into his deception and survived it, and refused to break, and was now standing in the study of his dead father, offering to walk into a room full of predators and defend a marriage that was built on a lie she did not choose. "Beside me," he said. "Beside you." The 18 days before the assembly passed in a state of accelerating preparation that resembled the hours before a military engagement more than any political exercise Aldrich had previously experienced. Mercer coordinated intelligence operations with the compressed intensity of a man trying to map an entire battlefield before the first shot. Eveline continued her excavation of the estate's records, building a financial counter-narrative so detailed and so thoroughly documented that every accusation Lucian could make would land in a context already defined by the Blackthorne defense. They worked, side by side, 16 hours a day. In the library, in the study, at the long table in the great hall where maps and documents accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of evidence and counter-evidence, and the raw material of a legal and political war being fought with paper instead of bullets, though the casualties would be equally real. And somewhere in those 18 days, in the space between strategy sessions and arguments and the exhausted silences of two people pushing their capacity to its limit, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not romance, something harder and more durable than either. The specific bond that forms between people who have seen each other at their worst and decided, not from sentiment, but from something colder and more honest, that the worst is survivable. Aldrich slept on a cot in the study, not because Evelyn banished him from the Duchess's chambers, but because the work required proximity to the documents, and the proximity to the documents had become a form of proximity to her. They ate meals together at the study desk, argued over strategy, disagreed about tactics, found, in the friction between their perspectives, the particular kind of strength that exists when two different kinds of intelligence attack the same problem from opposite directions. She taught him things he did not know about his own estate. Relationships between tenant families that had evolved over decades into networks of mutual support, invisible to any duke who viewed his lands from the elevation of a castle. Economic dependencies that meant the failure of one farm could cascade through 6 others. Human systems operating beneath the financial systems, alive and complex and completely absent from any ledger. He taught her the political landscape, the allegiances that defined the Scottish aristocracy, who owed whom, who feared whom, who would vote based on principle, and who would vote based on the direction the wind was blowing that morning. The language of assembly proceedings, where a single word misplaced could shift the interpretation of an entire argument. The specific rules of engagement that governed a world where violence wore silk and destruction was delivered through ink on paper. They became, during those 18 days, something that neither of them had a word for. Not husband and wife in any traditional sense, not allies in the purely strategic sense. Something forged under pressure in the way that certain metals only achieve their strongest form when subjected to heat and force that would destroy lesser materials. The winter assembly opened on a Saturday. Blackthorne Keep filled with aristocrats the way a river fills a valley during flood season, gradually and then all at once. Carriages arrived through the iron gates in a procession that lasted 3 hours. Nobles in winter furs and imported silks emerged into the Scottish cold and were escorted through corridors that Evelyn had. Ordered, prepared with the specific combination of warmth and authority that communicated welcome without conceding dominance. The great hall had been transformed. 400 candles burned in chandeliers that cast light across stone walls hung with blackthorn banners. Tables lined 3 sides of the room. The 4th side held a raised platform where the Crown's representatives sat. 3 men in formal judicial attire whose combined authority to rule on matters of Scottish peerage made them the most powerful people in the building despite occupying the least physical space. Lucien arrived an hour before the proceedings. Aldrich watched from the upper gallery as his cousin entered the great hall with the confident stride of a man walking into a room he believes he already owns. Lucien was 38, lean, handsome in the particular way that men are handsome when their features have been shaped by constant calculation rather than natural ease. His eyes swept the hall, found the Crown's representatives, found the nobles whose loyalty he had purchased, found the empty seats where Aldrich and Eveline would sit. He smiled. Aldrich turned from the gallery and walked to the study where Eveline was making final preparations. She wore a dress that Aldrich's replacement had sourced from Edinburgh, dark green against the black stone of the castle. Simple in design, devastating in the way it transformed her from a woman in a room to the woman in the room. Her hair was pinned with the same functional precision she applied to everything, and her face held an expression that Kaedric was learning to associate with her most dangerous state. Calm. Completely calm. The calm of a person who has already processed every possible outcome and decided that fear is an indulgence she cannot afford. "Ready?" he said. "That depends on your definition. If ready means prepared, then yes. If ready means confident, then no. Confidence is for people who can predict outcomes. I can't predict this. Neither can you. I can predict Lucien's opening move. He'll present the treason charges first, theatrical, designed to set the tone before anyone else can speak. And your opening move? I stand up, I tell the truth, and then I sit down and let you finish what I started." She looked at him, held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was longer than she had voluntarily looked at him since the night in the Southwark boarding house, when his name had detonated between them like a bomb. In those 3 seconds, something passed between them that did not require words. An agreement, a commitment, not to each other, not yet, but to the act they were about to perform together, which required a degree of mutual trust that exceeded anything either of them had extended to another human being. "Let's go," she said. They entered the great hall together, side by side, exactly as she had specified. The room reacted to their entrance the way rooms had always reacted to Kaedric's presence, with the instinctive recalibration of 300 people simultaneously adjusting their behavior in response to a force they recognized as dominant. But this time the reaction was different. This time the eyes did not land on Kaedric alone. They landed on the pair, on the woman walking beside the Duke with the posture of someone who had earned her place through something more demanding than inheritance. They took their seats at the front table, directly facing the Crown's representatives, with Lucien positioned at an adjacent table 10 feet to the right. Close enough to make eye contact. Close enough for Kaedric to see the particular quality of satisfaction that lived in his cousin's expression, the look of a man who has laid a trap and is watching his quarry walk into it. The senior Crown representative, a man named Lord Hargrove, whose reputation for procedural rigidity was surpassed only by his reputation for being completely incorruptible, called the assembly to order. "We are convened to address formal challenges to the title and authority of the Duke of Blackthorne. The challenger, Lord Lucien Blackthorne, may present his case." Lucien stood, adjusted his coat, paused for exactly the right duration to establish authority without appearing to delay. He was good at this, Kaedric realized. Good at the theater of destruction. Good at making violence look like procedure. "My lords and representatives of the Crown, I stand before you with evidence of systematic fraud, abandonment of duty, and criminal misuse of the Blackthorne title and estates by the man currently occupying the ducal seat." He produced documents. The room watched as he laid them across the table with the deliberate pacing of a man constructing a scaffold. Financial records, military commission papers, the identity documents of Captain Rowan Vale. Each piece placed with precision, each one a brick in the wall he was building between Kaedric and the duchy. The Duke of Blackthorne abandoned his seat. He fabricated a military identity. He enlisted under a dead man's name. He used ducal funds to finance personal operations in London. And he married under this fraudulent identity, producing a union that is legally void and an insult to every family whose bloodline depends on the integrity of the peerage system. Lucien lifted the final document, the marriage certificate, held it where the candlelight caught the ink. "This is the signature of a ghost. Rowan Vale does not exist. The marriage does not exist. The Duchess does not exist. And a duke who would commit these acts does not deserve the title he was born to carry." He sat down. The great hall hummed with the particular frequency of 300 people processing information that confirmed suspicions they had been nursing for months. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Noble heads turned toward Kaedric with expressions ranging from disgust to fascination to the careful. Neutrality of people waiting to see which direction the power would shift before committing their own weight. Lord Hargill turned to Kaedric. "Your Grace, you may respond." Kaedric stood. The room went silent. Not the gradual silence of attention being gathered, but the instantaneous silence of collective breath being held. 300 people watching a man stand up inside a building his family had occupied for 2 centuries to either defend his right to keep it or watch it be taken away. He did not look at Lucienne, did not look at the crown's representatives. He looked at the room, at the faces, at the eyes that held judgment and calculation and fear and the particular hunger that aristocrats developed when they sensed blood in proximity to power. Everything my cousin has said is true. The silence deepened, became something physical, a pressure against the eardrums, a weight on the chest, 300 people experiencing the simultaneous sensation of reality departing from expectation. I left the duchy. I fabricated an identity. I enlisted as Rowan Vale. I used Blackthorne funds in London. I married under a name that does not belong to me. Every document on that table is authentic. Every accusation is accurate. Lucien's face performed a rapid series of adjustments. Surprise, confusion, suspicion. The expression of a man who has just watched his opponent walk into a trap and lie down voluntarily, and who cannot determine whether this is surrender or something else entirely. I left, Kedrick continued, because I watched my father turn this house into a machine that destroyed everyone it touched. I watched him bankrupt families over disputes worth less than the wine on his desk. I watched him reduce my mother to a shadow who died in rooms that still smell like the medicine that kept her quiet. I watched the Blackthorne name become synonymous with the kind of power that feeds on the people it's supposed to protect. And I made a choice. I chose to walk away rather than become the next version of that machine. My team. Seats. His voice filled the great hall without rising, without performing. The voice of a man who has decided that volume is unnecessary when the content is sufficient. Was it cowardice? Some of you will say yes. Was it abandonment? The people who depended on this duchy while I was gone would say yes. And they would be right. I abandoned my responsibilities because I was afraid of what fulfilling them would turn me into. I ran from a legacy because I did not trust myself to carry it without being consumed by it. That is the truth, and I will not stand here and dress it in justifications that make it easier to swallow. He paused. Let the words settle. Let the room absorb the unprecedented spectacle of a Blackthorne duke admitting weakness in front of the assembled Scottish aristocracy. But I came back. Not because I wanted the title, not because I wanted the power. I came back because a man named Lucien Blackthorne began using the absence I created to build something worse than what I ran from. Illegal shipping operations through unlisted ports, funded militias in the northern parishes, bribes to magistrates and crown officials, the systematic theft of Blackthorne resources to finance a private empire that answers to no law and serves no interest except his own. Bassin. He turned to Lucien, made eye contact for the first time, and Lucien saw something in his cousin's face that made the satisfaction drain from his expression like blood from a wound. My cousin accuses me of fraud. I confess to it. My cousin accuses me of abandonment. I confirm it. But my cousin also presents forged documents accusing me of treason, and that is the line where confession ends and defense begins. Evelyn stood. The room shifted again. 300 pairs of eyes moving to a woman they had been told did not legally exist, rising from her seat beside the Duke of Blackthorne with the posture of someone who had spent her life being underestimated and had developed the underestimation into a tactical advantage. My lords, my name is Evelyn Blackthorne, not Ashcombe. Blackthorne. I married this man in a Southwark office under a name that turned out to be fiction. He deceived me. That is a fact I carry and a wrong he will answer for in his own time and on my terms, not yours. Her voice cut through the hall with the same precision she had used to correct tea-pouring technique in a Whitechapel basement. No tremor, no performance, just the clear, unadorned delivery of a woman who understood that the most powerful weapon in a room full of aristocrats was the refusal to behave like one. But I stand here today as the woman who spent the past 3 weeks inside Blackthorne Keep, not as a guest, not as a prisoner, as the person who opened the books and read the numbers and followed the money to its source. And what I found tells a story that Lord Lucien would prefer you not hear. She produced her own documents, the financial records she had assembled during 18 days of relentless investigation, laid them on the table with the methodical care of a woman who understood that evidence was only as powerful as its presentation. £3,000 routed from Blackthorne maintenance accounts to a solicitor in Edinburgh who incorporated a shipping venture backed by Lucien's associates. 14 months of payments authorized by a steward who was persuaded that betrayal was reform. Shipping manifests for cargo moving through ports that do not appear on any official registry. Financial connections to the Marquis of Whitmore, who is present in this room tonight and whose interest in this proceeding extends well beyond political principle. Whitmore, seated 3 tables back, did not move. His face held the expression of a man watching a chessboard develop in a direction he had not anticipated. Lord Lucian calls this marriage a fraud, Evelyn continued. Perhaps it began as one. But the documents I hold prove that the real fraud is the man who stole from this duchy while its duke was gone and dressed the theft in the language of rightful succession. The great hall erupted, not into applause, not into chaos, into the specific, pressurized murmur of 300 powerful people simultaneously recalculating their positions based on information that had just fundamentally altered the landscape. Alliances shifted in real time. Eyes moved from Lucien to Cadric to Eveline to the Crown's representatives, measuring, calculating, determining which side of the coming divide offered better odds of survival. Lucien stood. His composure was intact, but his eyes had changed. The satisfaction was gone. In its place was something colder, something that had abandoned performance and reverted to the raw, undecorated fury of a man watching his carefully constructed architecture collapse around him. Fabricated evidence from a woman who isn't legally a duchess presenting documents she obtained by unauthorized access to private estate records. This is theater, my lords. Desperate theater from a man who already confessed to the charges against him. The documents are real, Evelyn said. Every transaction verified, every signature authenticated. If Lord Lucien disputes them, I invite him to submit to a full audit of his financial holdings. Tonight, under Crown supervision. If he has nothing to hide, the audit will confirm it. If he does have something to hide, his refusal to submit will tell this assembly everything it needs to know. Lucien's jaw clenched. The tendons in his neck pulled taut. His eyes moved to Whitmore, seeking something, a signal, a strategy. A lifeline from the man whose resources had underwritten this entire campaign. Whitmore's face gave him nothing. The Marquis was already performing his own calculations, and those calculations no longer included Lucien as a viable investment. Lord Hargrove leaned forward. Lord Lucien, the Duchess raises a reasonable procedural request. Will you consent to an audit? Silence. The kind of silence that reveals the answer before the mouth opens. I will not submit to a process predicated on evidence stolen from my family's own estate by a woman whose legal standing in this assembly is the very matter under dispute. Then this assembly will draw its own conclusions from the refusal, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had presided over enough proceedings to recognize the sound of a position collapsing. That was when Lucien stopped being a politician and became something else. Cadric saw it happen, watched the transformation in real time, the mask of aristocratic composure falling away, the political calculus being abandoned, the particular shift in a man's body that signals the transition from strategy to violence, a shift Cadric had seen on battlefields, and in back alleys, and in every place where men discover that. The civilized tools they relied on have failed, and the only instruments left are the ones that draw blood. Lucien's hand moved to his coat. A gesture that could have been unconscious, a gesture that could have been a man adjusting his clothing. But Cadric's body, trained through years of combat to interpret physical signals at speeds faster than conscious thought, registered the movement for what it was. A reach. Down, Cadric said. One word, not shouted, spoken with the flat, operational calm of a man who has issued commands under fire so many times that urgency has been stripped from his vocal register entirely. He pushed Evelyn beneath the table with one hand and turned toward Lucien with the other, and in the space between those two movements, the great hall of Blackthorne Keep detonated. The doors at the rear burst inward. Armed men poured through the opening, not soldiers, mercenaries in civilian clothing carrying weapons that had no business inside a political assembly. The chandeliers swayed from the force of the doors hitting the walls. Candles guttered and died. Shadows leapt across stone. Nobles screamed, the pure, unfiltered scream of people who have spent their lives insulated from physical danger, discovering what physical danger actually feels like. Lucien had planned for this. The political challenge was the primary strategy. The mercenaries were the contingency. If the assembly went wrong, if the documents failed, if the narrative shifted, violence would accomplish what procedure could not. Seize the keep, secure the crown's representatives. Present Lucien's authority as the only alternative to chaos. Aldrich felt the room transform around him the way a man feels weather change. The pressure dropping, the temperature shifting, the civilized architecture of political proceedings stripped away in seconds, revealing the raw, animal substrate that existed beneath every human institution. The substrate where power was not a title or a document or a vote. It was the willingness to act while everyone else was still deciding whether to be afraid. He moved, not as a duke, not as a politician, as the thing the war had made him, the thing that lived beneath every tailored coat and every strategic calculation and every controlled expression. A mechanism built for violence, refined by experience, operating on reflexes that did not consult the conscious mind before executing. He grabbed the leg of the nearest table, a heavy oak piece that required 2 servants to move, and flipped it on its side to create cover, shoved 2 frozen nobles behind it, took a candelabrum from the wall, iron and heavy enough to fracture bone. "Mercer!" His voice cut through the chaos with a frequency that bypassed panic and spoke directly to training. "North door! Get the representatives out. Now!" Mercer materialized from the crowd with 3 of his men. They formed around the crown's representatives, a tight formation that moved through the screaming nobility toward the north door with the disciplined urgency of soldiers executing an extraction under fire. Aldrich turned toward the mercenaries. 8 of them, spreading through the hall in a loose formation that suggested training but not military discipline. Hired muscle. Competent but not exceptional. Men accustomed to intimidating civilians, not engaging combat veterans. The first one reached him near the overturned table, swung a short blade in a horizontal arc, aimed at Aldrich's midsection. Aldrich stepped inside the arc, too close for the blade to achieve cutting force, and drove the iron candelabrum into the man's sternum with enough force to lift him off his feet. The mercenary hit the stone floor and did not get up. Pain exploded through Aldrich's left shoulder. Not a blade. A thrown chair leg. One of the other mercenaries had improvised a projectile. Aldrich's body registered the impact, catalogued it, filed it under damage that does not prevent function, and continued moving. He was inside the violence now. Inside the place where thought became motion, and motion became survival, and the distance between one heartbeat and the next was the total span of reality. His breathing synchronized with his movements. Controlled. Efficient. The breathing of a body that had learned to operate inside chaos the way a fish operates inside water. Not by fighting the current, but by becoming part of it. 2 more mercenaries. He engaged them simultaneously. The candelabrum caught the first across the jaw. The second lunged with the blade that Aldrich redirected by seizing the man's wrist and rotating it past its natural range of motion until something inside the joint gave way with a sound like a green branch snapping. The man screamed and dropped the weapon. Blood on the stone floor, sweat in his eyes, his heart hammering with the particular rhythm of combat that was both faster and more regular than any peacetime heartbeat. A rhythm his body produced automatically when the situation demanded maximum output from every system. And through it all, through the smoke and the screaming and the clang of iron on iron and the percussive chaos of civilized order disintegrating into its component elements, one thought occupied the center of his mind with a clarity that burned through everything else. Where is she? He turned, scanned the hall through smoke and movement, found the overturned table where he had pushed her. She was not behind it. Evelyn was on her feet, near the east wall, a mercenary between her and the nearest exit, and she was not running. She was holding a broken chair leg in both hands with the grip of a woman who had grown up watching men use physical force as a tool of control and had decided at some fundamental level that the next man who tried it on her was going to receive an education. The mercenary advanced. Evelyn swung, not elegantly, not with training, with the raw, concentrated fury of everything she had survived compressed into a single physical act. The chair leg caught the mercenary across the temple with a sound that Aldrich heard from 30 feet away. The man staggered. Evelyn hit him again. He went down. She looked up. Across the burning, screaming, collapsing great hall. Through the smoke and the chaos and the debris of a world tearing itself apart. Her eyes found Aldrich's. And in that moment, in the space between 1 second and the next, Something locked into place between them that was not romance and not strategy and not survival, but all three fused into a single, irreducible element. Then the east wall exploded inward. More mercenaries, a second wave. Lucien had committed everything. The hall filled with armed bodies. The remaining candles died. Darkness swallowed the room except for the fire that had begun spreading from overturned candelabras to the wooden tables to the Blackthorne banners hanging from the walls. Through the smoke and the firelight, Cadric saw Lucien. His cousin stood on the raised platform where the Crown's representatives had been sitting, elevated above the chaos, untouched by the violence he had commissioned. His face held the expression of a man watching a structure burn and believing that what rises from the ashes will belong to him. Their eyes met across the burning hall, and Cadric moved toward him, through the mercenaries, through the fire, through the collapsing remnants of an aristocratic assembly that had disintegrated into a battlefield. His shoulder screamed where the projectile had hit. His hands bled from gripping iron. His lungs burned with smoke. None of it registered as relevant. None of it reached the place where decisions were made, because the man who had betrayed his blood was standing on a platform in a burning hall. And between Cadric and that platform stood everything he had ever been taught to be and everything he was choosing to become. And the distance between those two things was closing with every step. Lucien saw him coming, saw the expression on his face, saw whatever lived behind Cadric's eyes when the last layer of control was stripped away, and the thing underneath, the thing that wars had built, and aristocracy had buried, and Evelyn had excavated, rose to the surface. For the first time since the assembly began, Lucien looked afraid. Cadric reached the platform, climbed the steps, stood 5 feet from the cousin who had stolen from him and betrayed him, and tried to burn down everything his bloodline had built. The fire roared around them. The hall shook. Somewhere, a section of roof collapsed with a sound like the earth splitting open, and Cadric Blackthorne, Duke of Blackthorne, scarred soldier, failed husband, reluctant ruler of an empire he had spent his life trying to escape, raised his eyes to meet his cousins and spoke 3 words that cut through the inferno like a blade through flesh. "This ends now." Lucien reached for the blade at his belt, and the great hall of Blackthorne Keep burned. Lucien's blade cleared the belt, and Cadric was already inside the ark. Not thinking, not calculating, operating on the substrate beneath thought, the layer where muscle memory and combat instinct and the accumulated data of 100 engagements merged into a single continuous act of motion. His left hand caught Lucien's wrist at the apex of the draw. His right drove forward into his cousin's sternum, not with a fist, but with the heel of his palm, a strike designed to displace the diaphragm and collapse the lung's ability to supply oxygen to muscles that were trying to kill him. Lucien folded. The blade clattered to the platform. His body buckled forward and Cadric caught him by the collar and held him upright because a man on the ground is a man who cannot be forced to look you in the eye, and Cadric needed him to look. "You had everything." Cadric's voice came from a register so low it barely qualified as speech. More vibration than sound. The voice of something ancient and mechanical operating beneath the surface of a human body. "I walked away. I handed you the keys to everything our family built. All you had to do was run it. Protect the people who depend on it. Keep the machinery turning. And instead you hollowed it out, sold it piece by piece to fund your own ambition. Turned the Blackthorne name into a front for smuggling operations and bought magistrates." Woes. Lucien coughed, blood on his lips. His eyes held the particular defiance of a man who has been beaten but has not yet decided to stop fighting. "You think you're better? You abandon them. Every tenant, every servant, every family that depended on this name. You left them with a ghost and a locked door, and you think coming back with a stolen wife and a confession makes you the hero? I don't think I'm the hero. I think I'm the only option left." "Then you're as deluded as your father." The words hit something, not the surface, deeper. The place where Cadric kept the specific wound of knowing that his father's blood ran through him with the same relentless persistence as the tides running against the cliffs beneath the keep. He absorbed the impact, filed it, let it settle into the sediment of damage that he would process later, if later existed, if the building did not collapse around them first. Fire had consumed the western banners. Smoke rolled across the ceiling in waves that turned the chandelier light into something diseased and orange. The great hall was emptying. Nobles fled through every available exit, their silk and fur trampling through debris and broken glass, with the desperate urgency of people discovering that wealth could not insulate the body from heat. Mercer's men had engaged the remaining mercenaries in the corridors beyond the north door. The sounds reached the platform in fragments, steel on steel, shouting. The particular percussion of organized combat, rhythmic and relentless, different from the chaos of the initial breach. Aldrich released Lucien's collar. His cousin stumbled backward, caught himself on the Crown representative's table. His hand found the edge and he held on with the grip of a man whose legs were no longer reliable instruments. "It's done, Lucian. Your mercenaries are being contained. The Crown's representatives are secure. Every noble in Scotland just watched you order armed men into a political assembly. There is no version of tomorrow where you hold any claim to anything." "There's one version." Lucien's hand moved along the table's edge, slowly, the movement of a man searching for something by touch while maintaining eye contact. "The version where you don't walk off this platform." His fingers found what they were searching for. A second blade, smaller, concealed beneath the judicial papers that still littered the table's surface. Aldrich saw the glint of metal in the firelight at the same moment his body registered the shift in Lucian's weight, the subtle redistribution of mass that preceded a committed forward motion. Lucian lunged. Aldrich sidestepped. The blade passed through the space his torso had occupied a quarter-second earlier. He caught Lucian's extended arm, redirected the momentum, and used his cousin's own forward energy to drive him toward the edge of the platform. Lucian's feet scrambled for purchase on the stone, found none. The platform's edge caught him at mid-thigh, and his upper body swung out over the great hall's floor, 8 feet below, where fire was consuming the overturned tables with the systematic appetite of something that had been hungry for a very long time. Aldrich held him. One hand on the collar, one hand on the belt. His cousin suspended over the drop, weight pulling against Aldrich's grip, gravity making its case with the patient insistence of a force that always won eventually. For 3 seconds, Aldrich held his cousin's life in his hands. 3 seconds that contained the entire history of the Blackthorne bloodline. Every decision made in rage. Every rival destroyed without mercy. Every act of calculated violence that had been justified by the simple, brutal logic of survival. His father's voice spoke from the dead space inside his memory. Sentiment is a disease. Hesitation makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable Blackthorns end up in the ground. Drop him. The thought arrived with the mechanical clarity of a system executing its programming. Drop him, and the rebellion dies. Drop him, and every political challenge evaporates. Drop him, and the Blackthorne dynasty continues under the same operating principles that have governed it for 2 centuries. The fire roared below. Lucien's eyes, wide and wild and filled with the animal terror of a mammal staring at its own extinction, locked onto Aldrich's face. And Aldrich pulled him back, not gently, not with compassion, with the deliberate, controlled force of a man making a choice that his entire bloodline would have condemned. He hauled Lucian onto the platform and dropped him on the stone and stood over him while smoke swirled around them, and the great hall of Blackthorne Keep burned with the accumulated fuel of centuries of power exercised without restraint. "Get up." Lucien lay on the stone, breathing hard, blood from his lips smeared across his chin. His eyes stared at the ceiling, where fire painted shadows that moved like living things. "I said get up." Lucien got up, slowly, with the mechanical compliance of a man whose body had accepted defeat before his mind finished negotiating with the concept. He stood on the platform and looked at his cousin, and on his face was an expression that Aldrich had never seen directed at him by anyone. Confusion. Pure, unprocessed confusion. The expression of a man whose understanding of how the world works has just been contradicted by evidence he cannot dismiss. "You should have dropped me." "I know. Any Blackthorne would have dropped me. Your father would have dropped me before I finished falling." "I know that too." "Then why?" Aldrich looked at his cousin, at the blood and the smoke and the terror and the confusion and the burning hall that had been the seat of Blackthorne power for 200 years. He looked at all of it and he searched inside himself for the answer and found it in a place he had not expected. Not in the soldier, not in the duke. In the man who had walked into a church basement in Whitechapel and learned how to pour tea from a woman who refused to let broken men die from neglect. Because I'm tired of the ground being full of blackthorns. Mercer arrived on his platform 30 seconds later with 4 of his men. They took Lucien into custody with the efficient, impersonal handling of professionals managing a situation that had been resolved above their operational level. Lucien went without resistance. Something had broken in him during those 3 seconds over the edge. Not his body, his certainty. The particular certainty that the world operated on rules he understood and could manipulate. That certainty had been invalidated by a man who chose to pull instead of drop, and the invalidation left Lucien with nothing to stand on except the slowly dawning realization that his understanding of power had been incomplete. "The hall is lost," Mercer said, his face streaked with smoke and someone else's blood. "Fires moving toward the east wing. We've evacuated the assembly. Crown representatives are secure in the North Tower. Casualties among the mercenaries. None among our people. None among the nobles, though several will need medical attention for smoke and minor injuries. Evelyn, here, Shota." Her voice came from behind Mercer. She stepped onto the platform. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. A bruise was forming on her right forearm, where she had swung the chair leg. Ash dusted her hair, and her eyes held the specific clarity of a person who has just walked through violence and emerged with her internal architecture intact. She looked at Cadric, at the blood on his hands, at the smoke in his lungs that made his breathing audible, at the bruised shoulder and the cut across his knuckles and the exhaustion that sat on his frame like a weight his skeleton was barely designed to support. "You're alive," she said. "Marginally. The hall's burning." "I noticed. Your cousin?" "In custody." She nodded, processed, filed the information with the same efficiency she applied to everything. Then she looked at the burning Great Hall and said, "We should probably stop standing on a platform inside a building that's on fire." They evacuated the keep's Great Hall through the north corridor. Behind them, the fire consumed the western wing with a velocity that suggested the original construction had been more flammable than anyone had accounted for. Banners burned. Tables collapsed into char. The chandeliers that had held 400 candles melted from their chains and crashed to the stone floor, sending showers of molten brass across the rubble. Outside, the courtyard had become a staging ground for organized chaos. Nobles huddled in clusters, their evening attire incongruous against the backdrop of a burning castle, and the Scottish winter pressing down from a sky that had gone black with smoke and cloud. Mercer's men coordinated fire suppression with the keep's staff, forming bucket chains from the courtyard cisterns to the hall's exterior walls. The effort would not save the Great Hall, but it might save the rest of the building. Cadric stood in the courtyard and watched his ancestral home burn. Not all of it, the East Wing, the North Tower, the residential quarters, the library where Eveline had found the evidence that broke Lucien's case open. All of those were intact, protected by the keep's compartmentalized architecture, the thick stone walls between sections that had been designed centuries earlier by builders who understood that fire was as much an enemy as any invading army. But the Great Hall was gone. The room where Blackthorne dukes had held court for 200 years. The room where his father had entertained and intimidated and made men beg for mercy they would not receive. The room where oil paintings of his ancestors had stared down from walls with expressions that demanded their descendants. Continue the legacy of control and acquisition and the systematic conversion of human beings into instruments of power. Gone. And standing in the courtyard, breathing smoke-tinged air while ash settled on his shoulders like gray snow, Cadric felt something he did not immediately recognize because he had experienced it so rarely that his emotional vocabulary lacked the proper classification. Relief. Not the relief of survival, though that was present. Not the relief of victory, though something resembling victory had been achieved. A deeper relief. The relief of a man watching the physical structure of his inheritance collapse, and discovering that the collapse did not destroy him, that the building was not the bloodline, that the walls were not the name, that everything his father had told him about the relationship between power and architecture, between legacy and stone, between survival and the rigid maintenance of structures built by dead men, was a lie. The building could burn. He remained. The Crown's representatives emerged from the North Tower shortly after midnight. Lord Hargill's judicial composure had been replaced by something rawer. The expression of a man who has been seated in an assembly reviewing peerage disputes and has instead witnessed an armed insurrection and a building fire. His colleagues looked similarly recalibrated. The evening had taken them from procedure to survival and back to procedure again, and the transition had left marks on their faces that would likely persist for some time. Hargill found Cadrix in the courtyard. The Duke was sitting on the stone steps of the east wing entrance, his coat removed and draped over Evelyn's shoulders, his shirt bloodied at the shoulder where the projectile had struck during the fight, his hands resting on his knees with the palms up, as if he were examining something in them that only he could see. "Your Grace, Lord Hargill, I'm going to be straightforward with you because the circumstances seem to demand it." Hargill's voice had lost its judicial formality. What remained was the voice of a man speaking to another man in the aftermath of something neither of them had anticipated. "What you did tonight was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've witnessed in 30 years of Crown service, confessing to every charge against you in front of the entire Scottish aristocracy. I've never seen anything like it. I've never done anything like it." "No, I suspect not." Hargill paused. The fire behind him cast moving shadows across his face. "The Crown's position is as follows. Your confession is noted and will be entered into the formal record. The identity fraud, the unauthorized use of military credentials, the financial irregularities, all documented. However, the confession was voluntary. The counter-evidence presented by the Duchess regarding Lord Lucien's criminal activities has been reviewed and deemed credible pending full audit. And the armed assault on a Crown-supervised assembly constitutes a criminal act of sufficient severity to invalidate any political challenge Lord Lucien might otherwise have sustained. Meaning the challenge to your title is dismissed. You remain the Duke of Blackthorne. The Crown will impose conditions, naturally. A full audit of Blackthorne finances under independent supervision, restitution of any funds misused during the period of identity fraud, and a formal acknowledgement entered into the peerage record that the marriage contracted under the name Rowan Vale will require proper legal ratification under your true name to be recognized by the Crown." Cadrix looked at Evelyn. She sat on the steps 3 feet away, his coat over her shoulders, the bruise on her arm darkening in the firelight. She had heard every word. Her expression held the particular quality of assessment that preceded her most consequential decisions. "The marriage ratification," Evelyn said, addressing Hargill directly. "That requires my consent." "It does, Your Grace." "Yeah, good. I want that clearly documented. The original marriage was contracted without my full knowledge of the circumstances. Any ratification occurs on my terms, with full disclosure, or it doesn't occur at all." Hargill nodded. "That is entirely within your rights and will be reflected in the record." He left them on the steps. The courtyard slowly emptied as nobles were escorted to intact portions of the keep where quarters had been prepared. The fire in the great hall settled into a lower register, the explosive consumption phase giving way to the slower, deeper burn of a structure being reduced to its indestructible components. Stone walls stood. Everything else was transitioning to ash. Cadrix and Evelyn sat on the steps in the cold. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was different from the silences that had preceded it. Not the hostile silence of the carriage north, not the transactional silence of the 18 days of preparation. Something else. The silence of two people who have been through a fire, literally and otherwise, and are taking inventory of what survived. "Your shoulder," Evelyn said eventually. "It's not broken." "I didn't ask if it was broken. I said your shoulder. It needs treatment. You've been bleeding through your shirt for the past 2 hours, and you haven't mentioned it because you've apparently decided that acknowledging physical damage is a form of weakness, which is exactly the kind of self-destructive male stubbornness that fills church basements with wounded men who could have been treated if they'd bothered to ask for help." Cadrix looked at her, at the ash in her hair and the bruise on her arm, and the expression on her face that was so fundamentally, irreducibly Evelyn that it made something inside his chest crack along a fault line he had been maintaining since the night he told her the truth. "You hit a mercenary with a chair leg." "I did." "Well, where did you learn to swing like that?" "I learned to swing a chair leg in approximately the same place you learn to flip tables and fight 8 men simultaneously. Desperation. The technique is questionable. The results were adequate." He almost laughed. The sound formed somewhere in his diaphragm and climbed toward his throat and stopped just below the surface, not because he suppressed it, but because his body was too exhausted to complete the mechanism. What emerged instead was something smaller, a breath. An exhalation that carried the weight of everything that had happened since a church basement in Whitechapel, and the particular irony of two people who had met over improperly poured tea now sitting on the steps of a burning castle deciding what came next. Evelyn, don't. She held up one hand. The hand was dirty and bruised and steady. Don't say whatever you're about to say if it's an apology or a declaration or a promise. I've had enough of your words, Aldrich. Your words got us into this. Every word you said as Rowan Vale. Every word you didn't say when you should have told me the truth. Words are the cheapest currency you trade in, and I won't accept them as payment anymore. What will you accept? She looked at him. The fire reflected in her eyes. The Scottish wind pulled at his coat around her shoulders. The castle loomed behind them, half burning and half intact, a physical manifestation of everything their relationship had been and everything it might become. Time, she said. Not the kind you measure on a clock, the kind you measure in actions. In mornings where you show up and do the work without needing to be told what the work is. In decisions that you make in front of me instead of behind me. In the slow, unglamorous, deeply boring process of rebuilding trust through repetition rather than grand gestures. That could take years, eh? It will take years, and you'll spend every one of them uncertain about where you stand with me. And that uncertainty will be uncomfortable and unfamiliar for a man who spent his life controlling outcomes. And that discomfort will be the thing that tells me, day after day, whether the man in the church basement was real or whether he was the most convincing performance in a lifetime of performances. Aldrich sat with those words. Let them settle into the places where his certainties had lived before tonight shattered them. She was not offering forgiveness. She was not offering love. She was offering a trial, a sustained, indefinite assessment conducted by the sharpest judge he had ever encountered, under conditions that he could not control and outcomes he could not predict. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever given him. I'll take it, he said. You don't have a choice. It's the only offer on the table. They sat together on the steps while the fire died and the night deepened and the Scottish coast made its sounds around them. Waves against cliffs, wind through stone, the creak and groan of a building adjusting to its altered condition. The keep settled, not collapsed, settled. The way structures settle when the parts that could not withstand pressure have been removed and what remains is the essential framework, the load-bearing walls and the foundations and the irreducible architecture that survives because it was built to endure exactly this kind of catastrophe. In the morning, Aldrich began. Not with declarations, not with strategy, with work. He walked the grounds of Blackthorne Keep in the gray pre-dawn light and assessed the damage with the detailed, unsentimental eye of a man cataloging what needed to be rebuilt. The Great Hall was destroyed. The western roof required complete reconstruction. Smoke damage extended into 3 adjoining corridors. The cost would be substantial. The timeline would be measured in months. He met with the staff, not as a duke issuing orders from behind a desk, but as a man standing in a damaged building asking the people who maintained it what they needed. Aldrich's replacement, a woman named Graves, who had served as assistant steward for 7 years and whose competence Evelyn had identified within 2 days of arriving, organized the recovery operations with an efficiency that made Aldrich wonder how many capable people had been invisible inside his household simply because his family had never thought to look below a certain level of the hierarchy. He met with the tenant representatives, rode out to the farms and the fishing villages and the small communities scattered across Blackthorne land that had been governed for generations by a name they feared and a system they endured. He listened, not performatively, not with the strategic ear of a duke cataloging useful intelligence. He listened the way Evelyn had taught him to listen, by entering a room and making himself available to whatever truth the room contained, regardless of whether that truth was comfortable. The truths were not comfortable. Tenants described years of neglect, infrastructure crumbling, rents that consumed margins so thin that a single bad harvest meant choosing between feeding children and feeding livestock. Medical care that was functionally non-existent. Disputes resolved by magistrates who answered to the estate rather than to the people the estate was supposed to serve. Aldrich heard all of it, wrote none of it down, carried it instead in the same internal compartment where he carried the wounds from the war and the expression on his mother's face in her final years and the sound of Evelyn's voice on the night she learned his name. He carried it because the weight was the point. The weight was the cost of having walked away, and refusing to feel that cost was the same as refusing to acknowledge the damage. And refusing to acknowledge the damage was the first step toward repeating it. Weeks passed. The fire's aftermath settled into the rhythm of reconstruction. Stonemasons arrived from Edinburgh. Timber came by ship from the northern forests. The great hall's skeleton was cleared, the charred remnants of tables and banners and chandeliers removed piece by piece, leaving bare stone walls that looked, stripped of their ornamentation, stronger and more honest than the decorated surfaces they had supported. Evelyn worked. She did not work beside Cadric in the romantic sense of a couple rebuilding together. She worked in her own domain with her own authority, toward her own objectives. She established a medical clinic in the keep's east wing, using the supply chain expertise she had developed in Whitechapel to stock it with materials sourced from Edinburgh and Glasgow at prices she negotiated personally because she had learned, through years of navigating systems designed to exclude her, that the gap between what institutions charged and what supplies actually cost was a space where competence could generate enormous leverage. She hired a physician, a real one, not the gin-soaked variety she had encountered in London, but a young woman from the University of Edinburgh whose credentials were impeccable and whose gender had made her unemployable in every conventional practice in Scotland. Eveline offered her the position with the straightforward pragmatism that governed every decision she made. "You're qualified. They won't hire you. I will. Start Monday." The clinic served the estate's staff and the surrounding tenant communities. Within a month, it had become the most functional medical facility within a 50-mile radius. Within 2 months, people were traveling from neighboring estates to access its services. The Blackthorne name, in the communities that surrounded the keep, began to undergo a transformation that no amount of political maneuvering or strategic communication could have achieved. It began to mean something other than fear. Cadric watched this happen from a distance that Eveline maintained with the deliberate precision of a woman enforcing boundaries that existed for reasons she was not obligated to explain. He slept in the study, ate meals in the kitchen with the staff rather than in the dining room, not as an affectation of humility, but because the dining room seated 30 and 2 people at a table designed for 30 created a kind of emptiness that neither of them needed. They spoke, daily, about the estate, about the reconstruction, about the clinic, about the audit being conducted by the Crown's independent supervisors, which was proceeding with the thorough, unhurried pace of bureaucratic mechanisms that operate without regard for the impatience of the people being audited. Their conversations were functional, professional, the conversations of 2 people running a complex operation in parallel, exchanging information at regular intervals, maintaining the shared awareness necessary for effective coordination. And beneath the functional surface, something else was happening. Something slower than strategy and quieter than politics and harder to measure than any financial audit. A process of accumulation. Daily acts of consistency building on each other like sediment, each one too small to constitute a meaningful change in isolation, but collectively, over weeks and months, forming a stratum of evidence that could not be fabricated or performed. Cadric made decisions in front of her, brought her into discussions before reaching conclusions rather than presenting conclusions after the fact. When he did not know the answer to a question, he said so, which was an act of such fundamental deviation from Blackthorne behavioral norms that the staff initially interpreted it as illness. When the Crown auditors identified discrepancies in the shipping records that required explanation, he explained them to Evelyn first, before the auditors, before Mercer. He sat across from her at the table in the library, the same table where she had found Aldrich's payments, and laid out every financial detail with the exhaustive transparency of a man who understood that selective disclosure was just deception wearing a more sophisticated costume. She listened, assessed, asked questions that exposed assumptions he had not realized he was making. Her mind operated on a frequency that complemented his without replicating it. Where he saw strategic positions, she saw human consequences. Where he calculated risk, she calculated cost. The difference was subtle but critical. Risk was what you might lose. Cost was what someone else paid. The distinction changed how he governed. Spring came to the highlands like a slow exhalation. Snow retreated up the mountains in increments. The sea softened from black to gray to something approaching blue on the rare days when the sun broke through the cloud cover. With the tentative commitment of a star that was not entirely certain it wanted to illuminate this particular landscape. Blackthorne Keep's reconstruction progressed. The Great Hall's new framework rose inside the old walls, a structure that Aldrich had redesigned with input from Eveline and Graves, and the tenant representatives who had, tentatively and with the appropriate skepticism of people who had been given reasons to expect disappointment, begun to participate in decisions that affected their communities. The new hall was smaller, more functional. The walls would hold no oil portraits of ancestral Blackthorns staring down with expressions of frozen authority. They would hold windows, large ones, facing the sea. Lucian's trial was conducted in Edinburgh under Crown supervision. The charges were extensive: armed insurrection against a lawful assembly, fraud, embezzlement, criminal conspiracy. The proceedings lasted 4 weeks. Lucien was stripped of his family name, his assets were seized, and he was sentenced to imprisonment at a facility in the south of England whose name Aldrich did not bother to learn, because learning it would imply an ongoing interest in his cousin's welfare that he did not possess. He told Evelyn this on an evening in April, when the light lasted longer than it had any right to, and the sea below the cliffs was calm enough to hear individual waves reaching the rocks. "Do you feel anything?" she asked. "About the sentence?" "I feel that he chose his path, and the path had a destination, and he arrived at it." "That's an analysis. I asked what you feel." He considered the question, not strategically, not with the instinct to produce an answer that served a purpose, with the actual, uncomfortable, unfamiliar process of examining his own emotional state and reporting its contents without editing. "I feel tired. I feel the specific fatigue of a man who has been fighting some version of this war since he was old enough to understand what his family was. And I feel something I don't have a clean word for. The closest I can get is that I feel like a building after a fire. The parts that were going to burn have burned. What's left is what was always underneath. And I'm not sure yet whether what's underneath is enough." Eveline looked at him. The April light made her face luminous in a way that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with the particular quality of attention she directed at things she was deciding whether to trust. She had been directing that attention at him for months, measuring, evaluating, running every action through the rigorous internal framework she had built to protect herself from men who used words as camouflage for intentions that served only themselves. "It might be enough," she said. "I haven't decided yet." "I know. But you're still here, on the study cot, eating in the kitchen, doing the work. Not because I asked you to, because you decided to. And that's different from everything I was taught to expect from men with your name and your power. Is different enough? Different is a start. Enough is something I'll know when I know it." He nodded, accepted the uncertainty the way he had learned to accept it over the past months. Not with the Duke's instinct to resolve ambiguity through action, but with the harder, slower discipline of allowing ambiguity to exist without trying to control its outcome. It was the most difficult thing he had ever done. Harder than combat, harder than confession, harder than pulling Lucien back from the edge when every Blackthorne reflex screamed to let him fall, because uncertainty meant trusting another person's timeline. And trusting another person's timeline meant surrendering the one thing that every experience in his life had told him never to surrender: control. He surrendered it, not once, every day. Every morning he woke on the study cot and did not know where he stood with the woman sleeping 2 corridors away. Every decision he made transparently, knowing she might disagree. Every moment of vulnerability he allowed to exist without sealing it behind the armor of competence and authority. And the instinctive Blackthorne reflex of converting weakness into weaponry before anyone else could see it. He surrendered control and discovered, through the slow accumulation of days that turned into weeks, that turned into months, that surrender did not destroy him. That the man who existed without control was not weaker than the man who existed within it. That there was a version of strength that did not require dominance, a version that operated through consistency rather than force, through presence rather than power, through the quiet, unglamorous, deeply ordinary act of showing up and being known. It was, he realized during a morning walk along the cliffs in late May, the hardest thing a Blackthorne had ever done. And it was the first thing a Blackthorne had ever done that was worth doing. On a Tuesday evening in early June, Evelyn knocked on the study door. Aldrich opened it. She stood in the corridor wearing the expression that he had catalogued over months of careful observation as her decision face. The expression that preceded actions she had already committed to internally and was now executing externally. An expression that tolerated no negotiation because the negotiation had already occurred, silently, inside the formidable architecture of her mind. "I've been watching you," she said. "I know. For 5 months. Every day. Every decision. Every interaction with the staff. With the tenants. With the auditors. With Mercer. With me. I've been building a case, Kedrick. The same way I built the case against Lucian. Evidence-based. Documented. Thorough. And what does the evidence show? Look, it shows a man who is not his father. Not because he's better than his father. Because he chose to be different from his father every single day, even when being different was harder and slower and more uncertain than being the same. That's not redemption. Redemption implies the damage is repaired. The damage isn't repaired. It's managed. It's acknowledged. It's carried with the awareness that carrying it is the cost of having caused it, and the cost doesn't expire. She stepped into the study, looked at the cot where he had been sleeping for 5 months, looked at the desk where he worked until exhaustion overtook him, looked at the room that he had occupied without complaint as the price of admission to the trial she had imposed. "I don't forgive you," she said. Forgiveness implies an ending, a line crossed after which the transgression ceases to matter. What you did will always matter. It will always be part of the architecture of what exists between us. I will always know that the man I married was wearing a mask when he married me. That knowledge doesn't disappear. I know, but I've decided something. She walked to the cot, picked up the pillow, picked up the blanket, held them against her chest with the same practical grip she used when carrying medical supplies through the corridors of a Whitechapel basement. I've decided that the man underneath the mask is someone I want in my life. Not because he's earned it through some transactional accumulation of good behavior, because I've watched him long enough to understand that the behavior isn't transactional, it's who he is. The man in the church basement was real. The Duke who confessed in front of 300 aristocrats was real. The man who pulled his cousin back from the edge when every instinct told him to let go was real. They're all the same man. And that man has been sleeping on a cot for 5 months, which is long enough. She turned and walked toward the door, stopped in the doorway, looked back at him over her shoulder with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but something more honest than either. The expression of a woman who has completed an assessment and arrived at a conclusion and is now implementing. The conclusion with the same decisive efficiency she applied to reorganizing medical supply chains. "The Duchess's chambers are down the corridor. You know where they are. Bring your pillow." She left. Kedrick stood alone in the study, the room that had been his home for 5 months, the cot, the desk, the window overlooking the cliffs where the sea made its sounds against the rocks, with the rhythmic persistence of something that would continue regardless of what happened inside the buildings above. He picked up nothing, stood for a full minute in the center of the room, breathing, feeling the particular weight of a moment that he recognized as a threshold, not the threshold of a castle or a bedroom or a marriage, the threshold between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, a man who was not his father. Not because of a single dramatic choice, but because of 5 months of undramatic ones. He walked to the doorway, down the corridor, to the chambers where his mother had lived and suffered and vanished, and where his wife had slept alone for 5 months while deciding whether the man who had deceived her was capable of becoming the man who deserved her. The door was open. He walked through it. Behind him, Blackthorne Keep settled on its foundations. The new Great Hall, still under construction, sat open to the sky where the roof had not yet been completed. Through the gap, stars were visible above the Scottish coastline, cold and permanent and indifferent to the concerns of the people living beneath them. The banners of House Blackthorne flew from the towers in the June wind. Not the old banners, which had burned, new ones, the same crest, the same raptor. But the fabric was different, lighter, woven by local craftswomen from the tenant communities at Evelyn's commission. The design had not changed, the material had, and somewhere far below, where the cliffs met the sea, waves continued their endless work against the stone, shaping it, wearing it, transforming it through the patient, relentless application of force so constant it became indistinguishable from time itself. The stone remained. It had simply become something new,